The Shinjuku Showdown from Jujutsu Kaisen has some of the biggest moments in the entire series. Yuji's domain, Sukuna's true form, Todo's reappearance, Yuta taking over Gojo's body. There is so many moments from this arc, it's actually insane. So I thought I would break down every single detail from Shinjuku Showdown from chapter 237 right up to when Sukuna falls in chapter 268. And if you want to see every detail from Gojo vs Sukuna, I suggest you go and watch this video. It's got its own dedicated video that you can check out here. So without further ado, sit back, grab your water, grab your popcorn, and enjoy the epic adventure that is every single detail that you missed in the Shinjuku Showdown, with a slight dose of theories from myself based on pre-existing evidence and context clues. Now, before we get any further, I want to disclose that throughout this video you may see panels with Japanese text on them. If these panels are used, it is because it's the clarity of image here. They come from the digital volumes of volume 29 and 30. I will only be using these as an image reference for clarity because some scans that we have are just not that good, but I will be mainly using the text from Viz and TCB for any details that are pointed out. In chapter 237, Kashimo descends from the sky ready to fight against the king of Kaisens, Sukuna. And it should be noted that as Kashimo is dropping down, we see an aerial view of Sukuna, who in the previous chapter had just killed Gojo. However, Gojo's body is nowhere to be seen, and that is due to Wee Wee's technique coming in to collect his body with his teleportation technique. Wee Wee is pretty integral to the plans and schemes of the Jujutsu High students. There's a few key players throughout all of this, and I'll point them out as we go along, but the narrator mentions here how despite vaulting 203 meters off the ground, a heaping mass of ice towered above Kashimo. Now, there was a slight hint that Kashimo was descending from the sky here, which we later come to find out in chapter 269, that Kashimo was actually descending from Rika, who had actually been shapeshifted into some sort of mobile base of operations hot air balloon, where the Jujutsu High students were watching the entire Gojo versus Sukuna fight play out with the help of Mei-Mei's Crow, like a pay-per-view Mike Tyson versus Muhammad Ali fight. It was just kind of insane to watch go down if you're a Jujutsu sorcerer. Now, as I mentioned before, despite Kashimo being 203 meters up in the air, that block of ice that Urumi stood upon was even higher. And even higher still was the restless gambler Hikari Kinji himself, which Urumi even questions an attack from above, question mark. My speculation here is that Kashimo leapt from Rika, and Rika moved to a higher point to allow Hikari to get the literal drop on top of Urumi here. Kashimo also makes the comment, so you came after all. Fucking comment on that. But this is a reference to Hikari and Kashimo's binding vow, or their promise or deal that they made at the end of their fight, stipulating that if Kashimo gave Hikari all of his points, he would take him to fight Sukuna. Also, bonus points, Kashimo was sort of under the impression that Hikari is actually Sukuna's senpai. Kind of weird, but Hikari and me engage in a fight with Hikari instantly activating his domain and trapping Urumi. However, the block of ice continued to fall, delivering to Sukuna a weapon that he'd once wielded in the Heian era, the Kamo Toki. And now, as the narrator mentions, luck would have it, its effect happened to be nullified by a particular characteristic innate to Kashimo's cursed energy, his resistance to electricity. Now, we saw this already during Kashimo's fight against Hikari, against Panda, where Panda explains that if Kashimo's body is, it's like it's always electrified here. Cursed energy trait also acts like a domain sure hit. Kashimo only needs to make contact with his opponent a few times before unleashing a bolt of lightning through the atmosphere that pretty much never misses, ever. Now, Kashimo goes on to ask if he earned the title of the strongest, or was he just simply born that way? Now, Sukuna replies, who knows? I was born a cursed, unwanted little wretch, that much I can say, which later down in the line of chapters in 257, Sukuna reveals that he was born and he was supposed to be a twin, but forced by his own mother's blight, he consumed said twin in the womb, which I suppose when you do that, you probably born an unwanted child. I mean, this dude had a taste for human flesh before he even left the womb, so that was kind of crazy. But Kashimo continues to question Sukuna further, asking how can he connect with others? How can you love those beneath you while knowing nothing of weakness? That's something I've never understood, and I was always surrounded by people as feeble as the dirt beneath my feet. Now, at this point, we are cast into a small flashback of old man Kashimo. Remember, Kashimo was of a rare breed of sorcerer. Kashimo was someone who actually managed to die of old age 400 years ago before finding a strong enough opponent to defeat him, which is where he made the binding vow with Kenjaku to reincarnate into the modern era for these Culling games here in order to fight Sukuna. So naturally, as you can imagine, when you spend 400 years just floating around in nothingness, waiting to be reincarnated to fight Sukuna, you'd probably have quite a few questions on your mind, especially considering this guy's like the #1 Sukuna fanboy here. Now, in a rare moment of agreement, Sukuna agrees to teach Kashimo. This was likely due to him being in such a good mood from his fight with Gojo that he agreed, and thus Kashimo and Sukuna begin to fight, with Kashimo attempting a downward strike on Sukuna, and Sukuna simply parrying it and taking a back step. It's here we're finally treated to Kashimo's curse technique, Mythic Beast Amber. Now, this was a chaos technique that Kashimo was willing to take to the grave with him. He was willing to be killed by Hikari during their fight before even activating this, as he swore to himself he would save this for Sukuna, as it could only be used once. Now, this initial flurry of attacks seemingly catches Sukuna completely off guard, with Kashimo landing a 2-punch combo on Sukuna, once again forcing him to take the back step. From here, Kashimo launches a sound blast at Sukuna that Sukuna mentions is just simply too loud. As Kashimo presses the attack, we are given the description and details of just what this chaos technique is and what it can do. Mythic Beast Amber transforms Kashimo's body, rendering any phenomena that can be created by electricity a weapon in his arsenal. Now, Kashimo presses Sukuna once more, with Sukuna narrowly dodging Kashimo's blast. However, Kashimo does what any smart fighter would do in this situation and takes advantage of Sukuna's handicap. Sukuna, having lost an eye from his fight with Gojo, is now left with a blind spot, one that Kashimo takes advantage of and strikes at Sukuna, knocking him away. We get a further explanation on Kashimo's chaos technique, increasing the agility by activating his brain electrical signals, optimizing and tuning sound waves to match the natural frequencies of materials, vaporizing irradiated objects using electromagnetic waves. Kashimo's body has surpassed the limits of mankind. If you're familiar with Hunter x Hunter, think of like Killua's Godspeed and his Speed of Whirlwind there. It's kind of the same sort of thing. However, due to this, once this chaos technique runs out, Kashimo's body will crumble. During Kashimo's brief exchanges with Sukuna, he had managed to land 3 clean hits on Sukuna, meaning Kashimo was now primed to unleash a lightning strike that cannot miss on Sukuna. Due to this very same lightning strike landing on Sukuna, it is revealed that apart from reverse chaos technique, Sukuna has one method of restoring his body, and he only gets to use it a single time, a method that he'd intentionally been suspending this whole time, and thus fully incarnated. Now, this had been hinted at a couple of times just after Sukuna had taken over Megami. When he had taken the bath to submerge Megami's soul, Kaku asks if he was keeping this face like that, to which Sukuna replies, if I'm going to be fighting amongst sorcerers, it's probably better if I maintain this kind of appearance. Theory time, but it's at this point we notice as a cut on Sukuna's finger. Now, it's my personal belief that this cut was actually the result of him intentionally halting his reincarnation. I imagine that this is like his fingers trying to split apart to get him the forearm form. Maybe, I don't know. I'd like to know about your thoughts of that in the comments down below. In the very next chapter also mentions how she bets he could switch his face back whenever he wanted, and this is because the face that she's used to seeing is his true form, the form that she fell in love with way back when in the Heian era. Now, regardless, Sukuna has now fully incarnated into his true form as a result of his fight with Kashimo. Kashimo's transformation allows him to form a third eye on his forehead, which allows him to use X-ray vision to fully observe Sukuna's form. Utterly immaculate. Damn, the glazing is fucking crazy. Anyway, we're introduced to Sukuna's true form, a form described as a sorcerer with no greater advantage. Having twice the number of arms and mouths, Sukuna is able to make a hand sign and use chants to strengthen his jujutsu with no strain on his heart or lungs. Now, it is without a doubt the most overpowered form within Jujutsu Kaisen, and in a previous video going over the details of Gojo vs Sukuna, feel free to check that out, by the way, I mentioned how at the beginning of that fight, Gege places a heavy emphasis on the skill of a jujutsu sorcerer being determined by how little they need to do in order to activate their jujutsu. The higher the skill ceiling, the less they need to do, basically. And I also detailed many times and many points of Sukuna doing this exact same thing. However, this form makes it so he never really needs to subtract anything from his jujutsu in favor of speed and efficiency. Instead, he would basically be allowed to consistently fire off his attacks at full power should he ever find himself in a 1v1 fight. That's a very important detail there. The 1v1 thing, very, very important. He is truly insanely strong within this verse. The narrator continues to explain how this same form paired with the chaos tools Kamatoki, the chaos tool that Uromi had delivered to him, and the Hiten, a spear that we see Sukuna wielding in this artwork, allowed him to annihilate the elite Celestial Squad and the 5 Warrior Generals who served under the Fujiwara Hoke branch. Now, the Celestial Squad is a squad that is also referred to as the Sun, Moon, and Stars Squad in the official release, and this squad was actually the squad that Uro led. And the 5 Warrior Generals is a squad that also rivaled the Celestial Squad in power. The 5 Warrior Generals is also the squad that Yorozu managed to defeat in battle, and on top of this, it's mentioned how Sukuna repelled the forces of Abe clan's Decision Squad, which included Angel and the remnants of the Sugawara clan. Now, this indirectly lets us know how Angel knows so much about Sukuna, but it also lets us know that Yuta Rikotsu's ancestors actually fought against Sukuna, as Gojo confirms in Jujutsu Kaisen 0 that Yuta is a distant relative of one of the big 3 vengeful chaos spirits, Michizane Sugawara. However, later down the line, Uro, who'd fought the 5 Warrior Generals, asks Yuta if if he was a member of the Fujiwara clan, and his attitude reminded her of them. Later, Gojo is asked this by Yuta, the same question in this chapter, to which Gojo replies, maybe he was a descendant of both of them, who knows? So I guess it's up to your own sort of personal speculation, but in the real world mythology, there was actually a Sugawara clan and a Fujiwara clan that had relations with each other's, and the names mentioned in this chapter, which I thought was worth mentioning. It's very interesting history if you want to go read up on that. Anyway, Sukuna and Kashimo continue the fight, Sukuna holding Kamatoki in his mouth. Sukuna parries Kashimo's hand while Kashimo tries to block Sukuna's punch with his knee, but is ultimately knocked back. In retaliation, Kashimo charges up a blast of what I can only assume is some sort of electrical phenomena and energy, as mentioned earlier, but we see Sukuna has formed hand signs in preparation to fire the second world slash of the series. Now, Sukuna demonstrates just how freaky his body is, which hand signs from his lower hands, open palm pointing towards Kashimo, on the mouth on his stomach chanting the necessary chants. Sukuna with his main mouth tells Kashimo he should probably look out before firing and just stopping Kashimo's blast that is already in motion. Kashimo's hand is cut by this attack, as he notes, this is the attack that ended Satoru Gojo's life. Now, the two converse a little more before Sukuna validates Kashimo's strength, telling him he's strong, striking Kashimo with the Kamatoki as a distraction tactic and then attacking Kashimo from behind. Now, something I want to point out here is Kashimo's hand. A theory I have as to why Gojo wasn't able to RCT his body was because he was hit by a slash that not only cut his body, but also existence itself, meaning it's simply just not possible for Gojo to heal existence, kind of. And on top of this, Gojo was slashed right the way through the stomach, which, as we learned way back in chapter 37, cursed energy starts in the stomach and moves outwards, but RCT is controlled by the brain, as explained by Kashimo during his fight with Hikari, and further validated by Kenjaku in his fight against Hazanoki. So, cutting off the source of cursed energy is pivotal in stopping a user of reverse curse technique. Think of it like cutting the power to a motherboard to run the program of RCT. And yes, Gojo was sliced down the middle by Toji, but that source wasn't cut completely off like what happened to Gojo and also Yuki in her fight. Kenjaku, again, does the same thing to Yuki, who is an RCT user who has his stomach completely blown out and is cut in half, and she cannot heal from this. Later on, Kenjaku does this exact same thing or similar thing to Hazanoki, stating that he cut off the reverse curse technique below the neck by stabbing curse spirits into his neck. Why do I mention all of this? Because, well, there's a lot of confusion when it comes to Gojo's death and how RCT works and how it can work when it comes to the world slash. But Kashimo's a special case because you see just after the world slash hits, Kashimo loses a finger and a thumb on his left hand. However, in the next couple of panels, they appear to be back. But what's actually happening here is Kashimo is recreating the lost finger and thumb with cursed energy or electricity, or a combination of both. I'm uncertain as to which, but think of this as similar as when Kusakabe recreated his broken blade against Sukuna. Anyways, Sukuna attacks Kashimo from behind, with Kashimo turning and trying to fire a blast at Sukuna. However, Sukuna simply stops this by grabbing both of the wrists of Kashimo, punching him with both his lower arms, causing Kashimo to cough up some blood, and then Sukuna casually hits the Hulk smash on Kashimo, slamming him into the ground and proceeding to throw him away like an empty can of Dr. Pepper. Kashimo once again tries to fire off a blast, but realizes this is the end, as he is about to become the waffled one. Listen, I'm sorry, Kashimo fans, I wish your boy got a better treatment, but a 1v1 against High Nera Sukuna is just simply not fair. Sukuna and Kashimo enter some sort of cursed world, some sort of dreamland here during Kashimo's final moments, where Sukuna tells him his feelings on strength and answers Kashimo's initial questions in depth. But this isn't the first time that we see them in this kind of world. We've seen Sukuna conversing with Jogo in the same manner, and later on acknowledges this phenomena in the domain of Yuji, which I'll get into when we get to that point. Anyway, Hikari's domain finally cracks as him and Urumi fall to the floor, with Hikari looking mighty pleased with himself and Urumi looking very frustrated. But at the same time, Yuji and Higuruma descend to the floor, ready to fight Sukuna Ryomen. Now, in the next part of the Shinjuku Showdown caused a bit of an uproar, because if you were reading Jujutsu Kaisen Weekly at this time, when the chapter switched up from Yuji and Higuruma entering the battlefield to a fight between Kenjaku and Takaba, people were rightfully annoyed. Now, while I do actually really enjoy this fight, I can't really consider it a part of the Shinjuku Showdown. I'm more of a little just side quest that Gege decided to take us on, so I won't cover everything in this fight specifically, except for a few Yuzuru Kotsu and Todo related details a little bit further on when they are relevant. But hey, if you want me to break down the Kenjaku versus Takaba fight as a whole, let me know in the comments down below. But for now, we will skip this part because, again, I don't think it's relevant to the overall plot of Shinjuku Showdown minus the Yuta details. So we'll just go straight into Yuji and Higuruma landing on Sukuna's head as if it's Fortnite Tilted Towers here. Once again, we see Yuji and Higuruma falling from the sky, having dropped in from the battle bus, also known as Rika. But we see Yuji sporting some flashy new gauntlets. Now, these gauntlets, which admittedly we have absolutely no idea on what it is they are actually able to do, but their main purpose was to cover Yuji's missing fingers. Now, this is a subject I'll get into a lot lot later down the line, so I'm going to put a pin in it for now, because I truly believe that this is one of the most genius tactics that he's ever done and misdirects for the audience also. From here, we are given a flashback of the battle plan for Yuji and Higuruma to fight. Now, up until this point, we've been going through the chapters in order to keep the flow of the video nice and organized. Now, as you can imagine, there was a lot of information to take in and digest during this arc. So with that being said, I'm not going to go over everything in these flashbacks because it isn't totally vital. Instead, I'm going to go over the relevant information when it comes up and when it is needed, because not all of the information in this flashback is absolutely valid and relevant, but if there are details that I see in these flashbacks that I think are needed, I will put them in. But to summarize this flashback, it details the Jujutsu High team working out a plan for Higuruma's domain to build up a court case that will ensure Sukuna gets the death penalty, as well as something that will confiscate either a curse tool or a cursed technique. Mainly a curse technique. They don't even say a curse tool within this battle plan. In the same way that happened to Yuji and his fight against Higuruma, but at that point, Yuji had no curse technique, so instead his cursed energy was taken. Now, Yuji comes up with a plan to ensure Sukuna gets sentenced to death, and we cut back to the fight, with Mei sending her crows to strike Sukuna as a diversion. However, Sukuna uses Kamatoki to strike these crows down with ease, and Mei notes how Gojo, Kenjaku, and Sukuna were all unfazed by her power, but notes that they all opted to dodge said attack. The reason she says this is because in Shibuya, it's revealed that Mei's crow strike, nobody's actually ever survived it except for Gojo. Now, it's a popular theory that I see floating around that Mei's crow strike might actually be fatal if it ever landed, but I guess we'll just never know. Regardless, we see Mei and Momo stood atop this building. You can make out the outline of Momo's hair and the broom here, which is funny because we pretty much just never see Momo again during this fight, which is kind of funny. This crow strike from Mei allows Higuruma and Yuji to approach, with Higuruma turning his judge's gavel into a massive warhammer and trying to bonk Sukuna with it. Yuji noted way back in chapter 164 that Higuruma's mallet can actually be conjured, dissipated, and freely even change its size whenever he wants, and this will be an important detail later, so again, put a pin on this one. The rocks that Higuruma smashes allow Yuji to close the distance even more, as Yuji uses the rocks as punches to throw them towards Sukuna, which is very similar to what Toji did in the anime against Megami's escape rabbits. As these rocks fly towards Sukuna, we see Higuruma's gavel wrap around the arm in an effort to restrain him. And in this panel here, we see the fist of Yuji approaching Sukuna as he prepares to land the first punch on Sukuna, which he rightfully just blocks with his remaining 3 arms here. Now, this is the first of many soul strikes that affect Sukuna, and this is something that I also want to put a pin in for later to delve into. Anyways, Higuruma activates his domain expansion and traps Sukuna inside of it. Now, when this chapter dropped, there was a few major questions. How did Higuruma pull this off? Why didn't Sukuna use his domain? And why didn't Sukuna use Hollow Wicker Basket? So Higuruma and Hakari have both a very unique domain expansion. Both came by default with their curse techniques, and neither Hakari nor Higuruma had to work on achieving a domain expansion. Instead, they were just sort of granted it. Now, because Hakari's sure hit is harmless, its techniques information is forcefully transmitted and it's activated very quickly. In fact, Hakari's domain when he fought Kashima was activated even faster than Mahito's in Shibuya, which by the way was 0.2 seconds. This also extends to Higuruma's because their domains are pretty much the exact same. As we already know, both Hakari and Higuruma's domains are special, very similar, meaning they are both extremely fast because Hakari's and Higuruma's are non-lethal domains. In fact, Higuruma's might even be faster because it doesn't allow any violence within the domain. However, Sukuna, having experienced Higuruma's domain already, while being inside Yuji's body, already knows this information prior, meaning Sukuna saw no need to use Hollow Wicker Basket because he doesn't need to. He knows there is no sure hit effect that is going to harm him physically. And this is the most obvious part, but I'll reiterate this anyway, regardless for those who have gotten. By this point in time, Sukuna was unable to use his domain expansion as a result of the lasting damage from Gojo's domain during their fight. Now, this leads us into the courtroom trial of Sukuna Ryomen, which Higuruma creates a retrial of his original trial against Yuji in 165, where Yuji admitted to the mass murder that he committed within Shibuya. However, Higuruma rules out Yuji's confession as something false and motivated by a strong personal sense of accountability. From here, we switch over to Hakari versus Umi. Now, off-topic rant, I truly believe that this is one of the biggest missed opportunities within the Shinjuku Showdown. I understand that they don't need to give every character a moment to shine, but having Hakari be set up as one of the big 3 only to not have any of his efforts or post-time skip training be shown off alongside Urumi, and also shows what Urumi could do in battle, absolutely made no sense to me. Urumi sort of serves as one of the biggest gateways to give us more insight into the early years of Sukuna, while also not necessary. It would also be very sorely welcome, especially especially considering how in the epilogue, Gege went out of his way to show us how Urumi and Sukuna met. But I guess that's just the way of the road. Hindsight is 2020. But Hikari and Urumi are flying through the sky during their fight, with Hikari being in jackpot mode. One of the details I've always loved about Hikari's jackpot is that when he's in this mode, his energy actually creates musical notes as he's fighting, and they are visible right here. Urumi tries to freeze Hikari with Frost Calm, an attack that she used the maximum output version of on Yuji and Maki when they fought Sukuna back in 215. Now, it's explained how Frost Calm is a technique that freezes that target by striking them with super cooled cursed energy, and it is the true essence of ice sorcery. I always find that fascinating that Sukuna is often represented as fire and Urumi as ice. It's polar opposites of each other. It's literally a song of fire and ice right here. But Urumi closes the gap and smashes the ice that throws Hikari's arm, and we can see Hikari's arm and hand inside of this ice block here as it is smashed. But Urumi thinks it's GG's for Hikari, and Ari's arm regrows almost instantly, allowing Hikari to grab Urumi and launch her into the buildings below. Now, funnily enough, this is the second time Hikari has done this to someone, and both times it happened with an arm being taken off. He did the same thing when he got hit with the lightning bolt against Kashimo, which again, also interesting. Both times this has happened, Hikari's been fighting an elemental Jujutsu user, which probably doesn't mean much, but it's weird that it happened twice. Now, while being sent through the building by Hikari, Urumi creates an ice spear and notes the following: the speed of his regeneration is incredible. It surpasses even Sukuna and Gojo, which firmly places Hikari into the highest tier of RCT users within the series. I don't think anyone has a better RCT usage than Hikari. But Urumi launches that built-up ice spear at Hikari, ripping a chunk out of his side, and lo and behold, Hikari, to no one's surprise, instantly heals it at breakneck pace, kicking Urumi to the left side, with Urumi grabbing Hikari's leg and attempting to freeze it once more before ripping it off. Once again, healing his leg at a breakneck pace, Hikari dropkicks Urumi, sending her flying. And you know how serious you gotta be in a fight to be willing to lose the Air Force Ones here? Regardless, Hikari does go and find them, but Urumi goes on to mention how she misjudged Hikari. The sorcerers of this modern era have this intense obsession with remaining human. They so desperately are wanting to hold on to their humanity, constantly telling themselves to hold back from destroying what would be so easily crushed with their overwhelming power. Now, I believe at this point, Urumi is referring to Yuji, having saw Yuji struggle not only in Shibuya, but against Kenjaku, but also against his struggle with Sukuna in the earlier chapter 215. Yuji is also just perfectly summarized by this statement, given what we learn with him a little bit later on down the line, how he can access the curse technique of Sukuna. Now, while all of this is happening, Urumi is freezing the water pipes underneath the ground, allowing them to burst, giving access to a large and vast amount of water to be turned into ice, declaring that she will destroy Hikari with the full extent of her power, seemingly summoning some sort of just massive ball of ice. And once again, we don't see what happens during this fight, and it just truly makes me sad. One like equal one prayer for that fight. However, Hikari's reply, with everyone talking about humanity, is it trending or something? I just got finished hearing the same kind of thing from my junior. He's a bit of a gloomy kid, but he's a man who sticks to his word, and you can't help but respect him. Now, this was a reference to Yuta's outburst about how he would take on the role of becoming a monster, in reference to the possibility of anything happening to Gojo and him taking over Gojo's body. And Hikari once again sums up Yuta's personality as he's a gloomy kid, but he sticks to his word. He went on to kill Kenjaku to save Gojo from killing his best friend again, and he took on the role of being a monster after taking over Gojo's body, and thus earning the respect of Sukuna, making him one of the rare people that Sukuna calls by name. Now, Hikari and Urumi continue to fight, and that's basically the last that we see of them. Again, off topic, just this little sequence is perfect summary of why I think Gege missed a massive opportunity skipping this fight, if I'm honest. But both Hikari and Urumi offer a unique perspective on their comrades, and they hold values and weight with their opinions here. Hikari being someone who's considered one of the big hitters, and Urumi who's been around Sukuna for his entire reign, I guess. But again, it's just the way of the road, rant over. We switch back to Yuji, Higuruma, and Sukuna, in which Higuruma is following the proper court procedure within his domain. Now, Sukuna has just simply stood there unbothered with his arms folding and waiting for this whole thing to just be done with. Now, as Higuruma is summarizing the case, the rules, and all the relevant information, Sukuna interrupts, declaring, "I've already heard the rules the last time I was inside the brat. What I'm interested in is that sword of yours. I couldn't care less about what I did or when I did it." Now, this statement couldn't be more true. I mean, the further into the fight we get with Sukuna, the more we realize this is the case, especially given his conversation with Yuji and what he tells Yuji in the final chapters here. I understand what you're saying, but yet it stirs no emotion within me. Sukuna is truly and completely unapologetic about his actions, the polar opposite of Yuji. Now, Judgment determines that Sukuna is in fact guilty, hitting him with the confiscation and the death penalty, which went all according to the plan of Higuruma, or at least so he thought. You see, when Higuruma and Yuji land on the battlefield, Sukuna is holding the Kamitoki in his top right hand, and even when the domain opens up, Sukuna is still holding the Kamitoki right here in this panel, and while inside of the domain, he's still holding the curse tool right here. But once the domain ends, Sukuna falls to the ground without the curse tool, and Gege even left Sukuna's hand open in the shape of him holding where he'd been holding that tool. However, due to Higuruma's lack of battle experience, he fails to notice this. With Sukuna smiling ear to ear, Higuruma's gavel transforms into the Executioner Sword. Now, with Higuruma reinforcing the idea that Sukuna likely lost the ability to use Ten Shadows technique during his battle with Gojo, there's a high possibility that what was confiscated was his shrine. Assuming Sukuna can't use any curse technique, I'm in complete control with this lethal sword. With all this happening, Ino, Choso, and Kusakabe land on the battlefield. And you know Kusakabe was serious here, because bro even spat out his little chew stick / ciggy here. I don't know what that was in his mouth, but he's always chewing on something, pat that shit out. Now, as the sorcerers all surround Sukuna, Ino attacking from behind, Yuji and Choso just off to the right, and Kusakabe along with Higuruma standing in front of Sukuna. Both Sukuna and Higuruma were the only ones to realize what had happened and what had went wrong here. I mean, of course Sukuna is going to notice this. His curse tool has literally been taken from his hand, so of course he's going to notice. But upon this revelation, Sukuna launches a barrage of slashes at Higuruma and Kusakabe. Realizing what's going on, the narrator chimes in. In the case of the target of confiscation being someone currently wielding a curse tool, what will be seized is not the curse technique, but the tool. Now, I saw a lot of people in the comments when this dropped weekly calling this an arsehole, and you're more than welcome to call it that, but if you do, I'm just going to give you this look. Because in a courtroom setting, any person on trial for a violent crime will literally be stripped of anything deemed a weapon, because that's just what happens. And that is exactly what happened within this universe, especially considering Higuruma's curse technique is based on real-life courtroom traditions. Higuruma is frustrated by his lack of battle experience, with Kusakabe coming in clutch and saving him via a simple domain. Now, these next couple of panels I like to think happen within a quote-unquote condensed time, similar to the stairwell sequence in Hunt x Hunter. I feel like this happens quite a few times throughout Shinjuku. I imagine that this is Sukuna thinking about these events that have unfolded in front of him, especially given this panel that we see Ino, Choso, and Yuji all running at Sukuna. But there's a lot to break down within these panels. One, why did Sukuna not just insta-kill Higuruma? Well, this is for a multitude of reasons. First being Sukuna's interest in Higuruma. Remember, he wants to see the Executioner's Blade. He wants to experience that from Higuruma here, because he states that's all he's interested in. Secondly, Sukuna's output was ever so slightly dampened by Yuji's punch here, which won't make a massive difference, but every little helps. Thirdly, Sukuna notes how everyone has all upped their fundamentals in cursed energy strengthening. Remember, Sukuna's slashes can even be survived through cursed energy toughness. We saw this with Ryu in chapter 216. Now, fourth, Higuruma, on top of reinforcing himself on top of Kusakabe's simple domain and Sukuna's weakened technique, we later come to learn in chapter 254 that Kusakabe pretty much is a specialist when it comes to this simple domain. And he notes how within his simple domain, his cursed energy output will get a boost, but the power of Sukuna's abilities will also weaken somewhat. So yeah, that's how Kusakabe and Higuruma lived here, due to a combination of their preparation and Sukuna's interest. And this topic of Sukuna's interests will come up quite a bit here, so bear that in mind. Kusakabe goes on to explain, now they know that not every slash is one capable of cutting the world. And if you stop to think about it, it makes sense that he would need a charger period or some sort of binding vow in order to expand the target of his technique. Now, unironically, Kusakabe nails it perfectly here, as we later learn in chapter 255, in order to activate this world slash, Sukuna needs to use the same hand sign from the Malevolent Shrine, which is known as Enmeten, and as well as chanting and specify the trajectory of his technique via his palm. Now, we see this exact conditions being met when he fires this slash Akashibo, chants Enmeten hand sign, trajectory specified via his palm. Now, these details are very, very relevant, as I discussed in my Gojo Sukuna breakdown. A lot of what high-level sorcerers do in a fight is all about misdirections and just shenanigans in general. Like Reggie says, a sorcerer is nothing but a con artist, and we see Gojo using trickery during his fight, as well as Sukuna doing the same. Yuta Rikotsu is also a massive trickster when it comes to fighting, and he dupes Sukuna multiple times. Todo as well, he does the same thing. And the reason I say this is because multiple points during the Shinjuku Showdown, many people assumed Sukuna was actually firing off a world slash at any given point. That's kind of not the case, which I will go into and I will break down step by step, as well as all the reasoning, the evidence for it. Now, remember, at this point, the Jujutsu students do not know the requirements for Sukuna's world slash, meaning at any given point, he could fire off without them knowing whether it was a real world slash or a regular one. This is because when Sukuna fired the first one of the students were watching, he only had one arm, and he used the bind and vow to just sort of fly that out. And now, as a result, he now has to use all these conditions to fire it. Now, Sukuna plays these exact mind games on Kusakabe in chapter 254, firing a slash that Kusakabe deflects, then firing a slash without moving a muscle or saying anything, and making Kusakabe believe that the world slash was next after Sukuna chuckling and saying, guess what's next? So I want you to bear in mind that there's a serious amount of shenanigans from Sukuna when fighting the students. Remember, this dude loves to fight, and he will prolong the fight in favor of his interests. Anyways, Gege goes out of his way to have Kusakabe remind us of Sukuna's slashes here. Any slashes that are fired are the smantles. Any slashes that land from touch are cleaves, and any ones that one-shots Gojo is the well slash. So yeah, that's what it is. Kusakabe is also concerned about Sukuna's flames that he saw in Shibuya. If nothing, this sequence lets you know just how actually smart Kusakabe is. Within seconds of being on the battlefield, he survived the dismantle and saved Higuruma, and also analyzed and proceeded to compile all theories and possibilities for angles of attack when it comes to Sukuna. The dude's he's kind of goated low-key. The flame arrow I'll dive into a little bit later, so we'll put a pin in this one again. Sukuna seems happy that the group has survived for now and decides to go for the legs, asking, should we have a race? Now remember, Choso was preparing to attack Sukuna from behind, firing off a pierce and blood, which Sukuna dodges with incredible ease, and thus turning Choso into the number 8. Now, one thing I like to point out during all of these fights is that, to me, the further into the city during this battle it gets, I like how consistent Gege is with the character's positioning around the city. Anyways, Choso is stabbed by Sukuna. Now, while this happens, Ino chucks the 7-3 curse tool, as we see right here. At the same time, Sukuna throws Choso at Yuji, and we see Yuji actually catching him right here. Sukuna knocks the curse tool up into the air as Ino dives to catch it and lands a strike onto Sukuna that is blocked. Sukuna figures out that this was actually Nanami's 7-3 chaos technique that is now made into a chaos tool. Now, this is headcanon from me, but I like to imagine this tool is now actually wrapped in the tie that Nanami used to wear, rather than the original bandages when he was wielded, considering how similar they look, the bandages and Nanami's tie. Now, Sukuna kicks Ino away, with Ino blocking this kick, noting just how heavy this attack is. Now, this wording for me really hit home, because if you've ever done any sort of combat sports, MMA, boxing, and you fought someone who weighs more than you, you realize why weight classes are a thing. So Ino's wording here made it hit home harder for me just how strong Sukuna's kick was actually here to him. Knocking Ino away, Sukuna is flanked by both Yuji and Kusakabe, to which Sukuna fires off dismantles at both of them, Kusakabe deflecting some with a sword, and the same thing we see him do later on in chapter 254, while Yuji blocks with his gauntlets. Now, I mentioned before, throughout the fight, there was many occurrences here of these gauntlets not being cut by Sukuna's slashes, which I'll continue to point out as Yuji is also cut at the same time, but the gauntlets survive it. Anyways, Kusakabe is at the apex of his sword swing here, and Higuruma rolls over his back, attempting to land the executioner's blade on Sukuna, which narrowly shaves pieces of Sukuna's hair away. With a big grin on his face, Sukuna grabs Higuruma's sword arm with both of his right arms, and with his left proceeds to punch him in the face. Grabbing Higuruma by the collar and asking if Yuji thinks he can keep up, he proceeds to yeet Higuruma as far as possible, which is insane. This dude just threw a grown man like it was nothing. As we see Higuruma flying through the sky with a grimaced look on his face, we see Yuji slightly ahead of Sukuna here, with Sukuna in the next panel being further, and in the next panel being even further away, until we arrive at this panel where Yuji admits Sukuna's just way too fast. This whole thing is like a petty way of letting know that your physicality that you hold so proud here, that you pride yourself on, the sturdiness that you have, it means nothing during this fight. I'm way better than you, and it just reeks of Sukuna's pettiness. Higuruma lands on top of a building with Sukuna not far behind him, firing slashes into the building, cutting it up. Now, we were given a flashback of Higuruma and the gang talking about the upcoming fight, and it's revealed that Higuruma is taking a pivotal role in the Megami retrieval plan due to judgment being able to differentiate souls in a body, meaning whoever was sentenced to death is the only person that was sentenced to death. So if Sukuna was stuck by the executioner's blade here, only he would die, leaving Megami left. But Yuji asks Higuruma if he has a death wish. Despite not having reverse gears technique, he's chosen to take on a pivotal role during this fight. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because it's the same question that plays through Higuruma upon realizing his plan had failed in the previous chapter. Higuruma and Yuji's dynamic is sort of one of my favorite, and I'd love to deep dive everything that they went through just in this video. This video is already going to be long enough, so I think I will save that for another video. But what I will say is, in this flashback, when it ends, Higuruma declares that he thinks his role is to die during this fight, and how he's become someone who can't even look Yuji in the eyes anymore. Now, we cut back to the present, and it was revealed that Higuruma is actually using domain amplification in order to nullify Sukuna's technique. Now, I talk about this in my Gojo vs Sukuna breakdown, but when Higuruma was fighting Yuji, it's revealed that this man was considered a genius amongst his peers, completing complicated tasks as if it was nothing but mundane to him. He managed to reverse engineer his domain expansion and learn how to strengthen his technique by controlling cursed energy, and he did this just in 12 days. And in chapter 225, it's explained that Sukuna is going to use domain amplification to get past Gojo's infinity, and Higuruma mentions how he thinks he's got the gist of this. He just saw it once, and he does just that. Higuruma activates domain amplification to nullify Sukuna's technique, and this revelation, it leaves Sukuna enthralled. Considering Higuruma was only a sorcerer for 2 months, he now has a talent that rivals even Gojo Satoru. Sukuna is thoroughly impressed by Higuruma. Remember earlier how I mentioned how Sukuna's motivation during a lot of this fight is purely for his own interest? Think of him like Hisoka, constantly seeking those with the potential of power, except less noncy. Sukuna notes that during this fight, his fight with Gojo, he paid special attention not to invalidate Maharaga's adaptation while using domain amplification. And he notes that Higuruma is actually achieving the same result here, the same thing here, managing to switch seamlessly between domain amplification and his curse technique, all within his first time of using his domain amplification. Sukuna has no doubts in his mind that this man is working with a profoundness of his ability at a level similar to him. This is the second time Higuruma is compared to one of the gods of the world here, but perhaps even better than that, a compliment is what happens next. Sukuna calls him by name, and you know you're doing Jujutsu correct when you're called by your name from Sukuna here. This is only a handful of people who have been given a courtesy within the series. Pop quiz, can you name every single person that Sukuna names in the series in the comments down below? I'll score them out of 10 if you get them. I don't know what I'll do. You might get an imaginary cookie or some shit. Anyway, Sukuna proceeds to slash up the building with him and Higuruma are stood in it, with Yuji stood outside watching it all happen. As Sukuna and Higuruma fall, they both charge at each other, jumping from the rubble that they stand on. As this happens, Sukuna throws rocks at Higuruma's face and slashes the rocks in an attempt to blind him momentarily in order to attack from behind. However, Yuji intercepts Sukuna's advance right here, trying to throw a punch at Sukuna in an attempt to cover Higuruma's back. Sukuna simply catches the overhand haymaker from Yuji, grabs Yuji's side, and then uses cleave to wipe a chunk of Yuji's side out. Now, this blow realistically should have killed Yuji. As you see in this panel, he is missing a massive chunk of his side. You can rotate this panel for a better perspective here. Something Sukuna says here that I found very interesting is he tells Yuji to take a look in the mirror. There isn't a single interesting bone in that body. Now, given the context of later chapters where it's revealed that Yuji is pretty much just Sukuna 2.0, I believe why Sukuna didn't like Yuji here is so much is because they're so similar yet so different. As I mentioned earlier, one thing that I like about the Shinjuku Showdown is how consistent Gege is with the positioning of his characters within the world in relation to where they all are and the buildings. Now, earlier when Choso attacked Sukuna from behind, his attack came from just off center of the direction where Choso was in when we last saw him, and it's a little detail like this that just helps to keep the action grounded for us, the viewer, and Gege continues to do more of this throughout the fight as we get further into the city within the Shu Showdown. As we see Sukuna stood up on this bridge where the building had collapsed, and in the next panel we see a jump up mark where Higuruma proceeds to lunge multiple attacks at Sukuna, which are just dodged effortlessly. Here Sukuna lands an uppercut and a grazing body blow to the ribs of Higuruma, who had responded by slipping behind Sukuna and trying to stab him from behind, but Sukuna's eyes actually follow Higuruma the whole time. As we see in this panel, Sukuna's eyes darting to the left to follow Higuruma. Now, I mentioned this before, how the shenanigans Sukuna pulls throughout this fight as to his slashes, how he constantly keeps the Jujutsu students on their toes in regards to what is actually coming next. Is it just a regular slash, or is it going to cleave the world in two? Now, I also explained earlier how I believe when a character is struck with the world slash, I believe it's personally something that cannot be healed. Now, this slash right here is one that a lot of people believe that is indeed a world slash, but I would argue it's not, and here is why. I'm going to give some strong evidence for this. Now, as I mentioned before, we'd later find out the conditions for Sukuna to activate the world slash: the Edmeten hand sign, full chance, and trajectory specified via his palm, like how he fired off his slash against Kashimo via his palm. However, in this moment against Higuruma, Sukuna uses 2 fingers to specify the trajectory of his slash rather than his palm. Now, as for why he uses chance, I believe he does this for a multitude of reasons. 1, he now respects Higuruma's ability as a sorcerer after witnessing his domain, the Executioner's Blade, and finally watching Higuruma nullify his earlier slashes. 2, Kusakabe mentions it's instant death if they get caught by cleave point blank or a dismantle of the world slash. No amount of cursed energy, reinforcement, domain amplification, or simple domains is going to do any good against that. And I believe Sukuna used chance to buff the output of his slash that landed on Higuruma in order to get through his domain amplification and get around the possibility of Higuruma simply nullifying his attack here. Why do I think it's this? Pay attention to Higuruma's sword. Here in this panel, it is a fairly large sword. However, just after the slash lands, we see the sword is a lot smaller, pointing to the fact that the sword dimmed as it did in chapter 246. and was in the process of reigniting. Now, you're more than welcome to disagree with me here in the comments, but I truly believe all the evidence collected and presented here points to the fact of Sukuna using a buffed slash in order to negate Higuruma's domain amplification. Anyway, Sukuna, looking somewhat disappointed, tells Higuruma to heal his arm. Then cutting off his other arm that held the sword and telling him that if he doesn't heal it, it's his head next. Sukuna is actively trying to push Higuruma further, which is another reason why I believe he didn't use the World Slash, because if he did use the World Slash, Higuruma would have most certainly died, and then that's all of Sukuna's interest gone down the drain. That's his favorite toy broken there and then. But Higuruma thinks back to this conversation with Yuji talking about how he should play a role in this fight and die during this fight. Now, at this moment, none other than Choso appears to fire rips in blood at Sukuna. How do we know it's Choso? We'll find out later on that Yuji wasn't actually capable of firing a pierce in blood and using convergence effectively without Choso's help. He actually had to rely on Choso to condense the blood for him before firing at Sukuna in a later chapter. Meaning the only other person that could have fired this blood was Choso himself. I had to clear this up. There was a lot of confusion when this chapter dropped, but it is actually in fact Choso. Anyways, it turns out Higuruma can indeed use reverse case technique, and he tries to stab Sukuna with it seemingly being successful until it's revealed that Sukuna cut his own hand off in order to avoid the stab. And in this panel, we see Sukuna's hand calmly on the side of Higuruma before delivering the final blow onto him. Now, this reminded me heavily of Nanami and Mahito in Shibuya, just how calmly a case cuts down someone Yuji holds very dear in front of him. And I think that was the intended effect, because as Higuruma falls, the final conversation that happens between him and Yuji goes through his mind, and as he sees Higuruma, he's reminded of Nanami once again, with Higuruma finally being able to look Yuji in his eyes as he falls, tossing the executioner's blade into the hands of Yuji. As we see here, Yuji grabs the blade and attempts to stab Sukuna in the back. Sukuna being Sukuna simply slips behind Yuji, pretty much in the same way Higuruma slipped behind him earlier, but Sukuna's eyes are once again constantly watching Yuji in this panel as we see Higuruma falling in the background. The executioner's blade runs out, implying Higuruma's death, or at least that is until the end of the series. While Sukuna's hand is healing, Sukuna turns to land a double punch on Yuji that is blocked by Yuji holding his left elbow with his right hand and lifting his leg. In response, Sukuna kicks Yuji away just after he lands a back strike from the same hand that he is healing. Sukuna fires more slashes at Yuji, and Yuji somewhat blocks these slashes. Once again, Yuji takes damage on the body here, but not on the gauntlets. Sukuna notes that Kamatogi is indeed still gone even after Higuruma's quote-unquote death, and then notices that Yuji's stomach has indeed healed, which is surprising. Wee Wee and Kirara then appear to take away Higuruma's limp body. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Wee Wee is kind of like an integral part of the plan, yoinking away the wounded to heal, and that was kind of how Gojo's body was taken away. Because remember, the rest of Jujutsu High right now was being deployed from Rika, who was floating up in the sky, which is kind of insane. But Sukuna determines that they must be taking the wounded to Shoko, who is healing them, but then notes how healing someone is no way near as efficient as healing yourself. And even though Shoko's RCT is different from both Gojo and Sukuna's, she doesn't really have that kind of power and able to heal others like that. Interestingly, had Sukuna met Hakari and had the chance to fight him, I imagine Hakari might have actually made it on this list of people whose RCT are actually stronger than his. But Sukuna realizes that within just 1 month, Yuji has actually learned reverse case technique, which we learned a lot later down in chapter 258, which also explains that his body allows him to convert energy into blood. This is also explained in one of the earlier chapters in Jujutsu Kaisen, and thus the barrier for entry with Choso and Yuji is much lower than everyone else's when it comes to learning reverse case technique. Which also explaining if Yuji absorbs their brothers, he should gain a body capable of just that, and their bodies will also allow them to compensate for the technical aspects of the technique, and that would mean the limiting factor of RCT, which is the immense energy expenditure, doesn't really apply to him, or at least so he thinks, because Yuji does actually suffer with that a little bit later on down the line, because as we learn later on in the finale, that Yuji can no longer heal himself because he's kind of running out of case energy according to Sukuna. But this leads Sukuna into a bit of an introspective conversation with himself, mentioning how Yuji has indeed improved, but it looks like cased brat will be his main dish, and this is in reference to Yuta Okatsu. He refers to Yuta as the cased brat or the possessed brat, and I mentioned before how Sukuna told Yuji that there wasn't a single interesting bone in his body, and I believe that this is just something that bugs Sukuna, because him and Yuji are so similar, but they are also two sides of the same coin. They're so similar yet so far apart, it's insane. Sukuna at first thinks that he's irritated by the death of Higuruma, but then he goes to think about Jogo, and he realizes that that's not quite correct. He realizes that it's the ideals that Yuji has. They're the ideals of someone that go far beyond himself, where Sukuna's ideals simply sit squarely with himself. Yuji sit with everyone else. Again, they're so similar, but they're so far apart. And eventually, Sukuna arrives at the conclusion that Yuji possesses an indomitable ideal. And Gege proceeds to draw them in a side-by-side fashion, as if to say, like, you know, look at them. They're similar. They're very similar here. But the further into this fight, the more we get to see of this. Gege really does tell us a story through not only the words and the art, but also how the panels are actually laid out with within the chapters here. I mentioned that within the Gojo vs Sukuna fight, how that was working out. But as I mentioned before, Sukuna during this fight gets up to a lot of shenanigans, and a lot of this fight crosses the lines of Sukuna keeping someone alive due to his own interest, but also then leaving them alive long enough to where he's taken too much damage to the point where he sort of can't finish them off no more. And at this point, Sukuna sort of crosses the line of keeping people alive based on his own interests, because Sukuna tells Yuji that this isn't a change of plans. This is just this once. I've decided to take your ideals and mince them to bits. He's now just foregoing the fight in exchange of trying to ruin Yuji's mental health, essentially, here. Now, as all of this happens, none other than Tengen, or Tengen's embryo, is delivered to Sukuna. Now, I'll swing back to this round in a little bit of a second here, because we do need to put a pin in that one. But Sukuna tells Yuji he will start by killing everyone, and then finish off the remaining Culling Game players, and then he'll complete the major, and have some fun with the new Tengen. But, as he says this, none other than Yuta fucking Gakotsu bursts onto the scene, crashing down between Sukuna and Yuji, as we see Yuta here, Sukuna here, and Yuji here. Apologizing for being late, Sukuna wastes absolutely no time in going to attack Yuta, and remember, this is Sukuna's main course as far as Sukuna is concerned now that Gojo is dead. We see Sukuna using two fingers and attacking Yuta with what I believe is actually a slash that Yuta sort of deflects. There's like a clanging noise here, and it looks like Sukuna coats his fingers in cased energy, but just under Sukuna's attacking hand here, we also see his lower arms clasped as if he's forming a hand sign here. But Sukuna tells Yuta, you've got to put up a good fight, because if you don't, everyone you love will die. And at this moment, none other than the Queen of Cases tries to crush into the building below. Now, as I mentioned multiple times, Gege's consistency in character placement during the Shinjuku Showdown as they get further into the city, it gives a sense of movement and progression. For example, here's Sukuna and Yuta's initial class. They're above this building right here, but then as Rika tries to crush Sukuna, they are now on top of this building. It doesn't just change randomly. Gege's very aware of the environment that they're in. Now, earlier on, I mentioned how I wasn't going to cover Kenjaku versus Takaba. Now, I did that purely because, personally, I don't really consider their fight a part of the Shinjuku Showdown. As I explained earlier, it's kind of like a side quest that it goes on, but I will be covering relevant Yuta Rokotsu related events later on down the line, and this is where those events start, and it also includes Todo slightly. But in chapter 249, we're given a little flashback to the event that transpired at the end of chapter 243, which is the end of Kenjaku versus Takaba, and those events are where Yuta Rokotsu ends up beheading Kenjaku with the help of Todo, who at this point in time was to remain hidden from everyone, including Yuji, especially Yuji. Very important that he was hidden from Yuji. But you see, when Yuta is brought in to kill Kenjaku, Todo is there to support him, but also to help refine his own new and improved Boogie Woogie technique. How do we know? Well, Kenjaku and Takaba's fight takes place near Lake Gosho, as mentioned here in chapter 239, where this random Culling Game player is running from Kenjaku, and then Kenjaku runs into Hasanouki and then also runs into Takaba a little bit along the line. It's also revealed in chapter 260 that Todo fine-tuned his technique with the help of Akatsu at Lake Gosho. And then it is also once again further confirmed in chapter 269, where Todo mentions how it's hard to say if Yuta would have succeeded if it wasn't for his help. But anyways, Kenjaku is officially beheaded by Yuta, and due to this, Kenjaku's body loses control of Chaos Spirit manipulation. So an ungodly amount of Chaos Spirits start to break loose. And when I say ungodly, I do really mean ungodly. You see, way back in the epilogue for Shibuya, it was revealed that Kenjaku's little stunt at the end of that released around 10 million Chaos Spirits approximately. And Yuta is assuming that the scope of these now released Chaos Spirits right now, right here at Lake Goshu, are also around the same amount. So that means Rika becomes a literal threshing machine on this bridge, murdering everything on this bridge as if it is nothing. However, now this is the point where the two chapters intersect and the timelines meet up, because in chapter 248, Sukuna ate the embryo of Tengen. That was because of Kenjaku that had sent that embryo over to him with one last rule entry from himself. The ability to activate the great merger between Tengen and humanity has now been transferred to Megami Fushiguro, which means it's gone to Suna. Because as far as Koganes are concerned, Sukuna doesn't exist, and Kogane only recognizes the body of the player, not the person controlling the body, which now brings us full circle back to chapter 248, as Yuta is now standing face to face with Sukuna, ready to fight and scrap it out with him. It's also worth mentioning that at this point that Rika wasn't fully manifested throughout this fight, but we'll put a pin in that for later, because that is a very important detail going into certain Gojo body related events later. But before the two engage, Yuta notices how Sukuna's reverse curse technique has started to return, and it might only be a matter of time before he can use his domain expansion again. Now, after some self-doubt and worrying about the what-ifs and possibilities of the fight, Yuta presses forward. In true Yuta fashion, he's a warrior. He's an anxious dude. He's just like me for real, for real. Stepping down from the steel beam that he stood atop, him and Rika become a force to be reckoned with as they go to fight with Sukuna. Rika uses herself as a blind spot to cover Yuta's attack, with Sukuna walking towards Yuta in almost the exact same pose that Gojo walked towards Agito during his fight with Sukuna. Now, Sukuna grabs the blade of Yuta and uses small, precise slashes like a chainsaw in order to touch the blade without touching it. Again, an ability strikingly similar to that of Gojo's in Infinity. And from this point on, by the way, we will see a shit ton of similarities between Sukuna and Gojo throughout this. It's very insane how close that those two get towards the end of the series and the finale here. Now, Rika approaches Sukuna from behind here, and Yuta releases his grip on the sword, and Sukuna's attention turns to Rika. Landing 2 hits on Rika in the same way that he did to Higuruma earlier, he keeps a hold of Yuta's sword and tanks a punch to the stomach. And with that last remaining hand, he uses slashes on Yuta, as we see Yuta being slashed up right here. But this punch that Yuta lands actually makes Sukuna's stomach wince, which is quite funny. I have to say that's got to be one of the strangest things that I think I've seen from Sukuna here. I always just imagine that this mouth might just have its own little personality also. Could be weird. But grabbing his sword back, Yuta tries to slash Sukuna, and Rika approaches, ready to hit Sukuna with what looks like a generator or one of those Japanese vending machines. Sukuna retaliates by slashing the vending machine generator into waffle pieces here, and we see the slashes here as Yuta tries to remain on Sukuna's blindside, with Rika trying to punch Sukuna further. As this punch from Rika lands and knocks Sukuna back, we see slashes land on her arm, while also at the same time Yuta attacks Sukuna from the back, with Sukuna blocking the slash. From here, Yuta finally activates his domain expansion, all-encompassing, unequivocal love, which perfectly describes Yuta Okotsu and his personality. To be honest with you, if you know anything about Yuta, you know that is the perfect 4-word summary for him. Immediately, without missing a beat, Sukuna activates Hollow Wicker Basket, and it is activated by Sukuna, with Yuta closing the gap and taking advantage of Sukuna's hands being fully used. Sukuna blocks the blade, only for the blade to unleash Thin Icebreaker upon Sukuna. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should, because it was being used for a while during Yuta's squabble with Uro, and it's the same technique that she uses and that he copied. This attack allows you to blow past any sort of guard. Theoretically, this technique could attack Gojo because it attacks the surface of the sky rather than the person, so it doesn't need to make contact in order to land. So debate that in the comments if you will. But this is the first time someone actually draws blood on Sukuna since he's transformed into his original form, which is very interesting for me. Score 1 point for my goat Yuta. For comparison, this is what Sukuna looked like going into Yuta's domain, and this is what it looks like when he's coming out of Yuta's domain. Sukuna begins to think about what is happening, noting how Megami's memories tell him Yuta's technique is supposed to be copy. They plan to keep half of my arms and mouths busy, forcing me to constantly maintain Hollow Wicker Basket, otherwise I'll be struck by the domain sure hit, which is most likely the Angel's technique. But as Sukuna is thinking about all of this, we see Yuji slowly appearing in the frame behind the text here, which is where Sukuna notices how all of this plan all hinges on Yuji's soul strike. From this point on, this is where Yuji starts to become a very pivotal player within the fight and within the Shinjuku Showdown against Sukuna. And to be honest, this whole stretch of chapters is genuinely just my favorite out of all of the chapters within Shinjuku Showdown. I've got to be honest, this and Yuji's domain. Let me know what your favorites were in the comments down below. We are given the lowdown on Yuta's domain from the narrator, which is as follows. Yuta Okotsu's all-encompassing, unequivocal love allows him to choose any one of his copied techniques to imbue the barrier with as a domain sure hit effect. His remaining copied curse techniques are scattered randomly among the katana within the domain. Only Okotsu can utilize them, and not even he knows which katana contains which technique until he grasps it for the first time. While each katana can only be used once, their number is infinite. Now, I want to point out here that it's random until Yuta grabs it for the first time. After he grabs it the first time, he will know where that technique is, which is why we see him using multiple techniques. For example, Thin Icebreaker and Sky Manipulation multiple times throughout this fight, because he just knows where those katanas are. While this is being explained to us, we see little pieces of hair surrounding and being filled with cursed energy from Yuta Okotsu here as they begin to fall to the floor. Now, this is because the hair is what becomes the Shikigami that attacks Sukuna, and we're told this back in the Culling Games from Uro noticing this, that these two Shikigami quickly rush towards Sukuna and wrap around while another one shoots diagonally up as Yuji approaches and lands 2 blows on Sukuna. Notice this panel here and keep this in mind, because every single time Yuji strikes Sukuna, his control over Megami's body drops, along with the control and output of his cursed energy. All of it drops. Rika attacks from above and forces Sukuna to take a step back, but in doing so forces Sukuna to leave the barrier that was created by the Shikigami, and thus slashing his back. Now, while Sukuna figures this out, Yuta appears from above and covers himself with Sky Manipulation in order to hide his attack. Now, Rika also literally throws Yuji like a furious punch kick missile and lands yet another strike on Sukuna, while Yuta attacks from the opposite side. Yuji, holding Sukuna's arm, into an armbar position here, you can see the vein popping on Sukuna's arm and the thumb twisted out to the other side here. While all of this is happening, Sukuna notes that he's unable to expand his domain, and his reverse case technique is still sluggish from his fight with Gojo. And right now, his total cased energy matches Yuta, which is a lot, by the way, because Yuta had more cased energy than Gojo, and Sukuna was estimated to have double Yuta's cased energy by Yuta himself. Now, Sukuna notes that while maintaining a hollow wicker basket, it renders him unable to use the world slashes. Don't forget, he can't meet the necessary requirements in order to do so. Now, Sukuna notes that while Yuji keeps chipping away at him, his cased energy output will continue to fall, and his control over this body will weaken, as I talked about earlier, until eventually he can't use hollow wicker basket and Yuji's sure hit will land. Interestingly enough, this little plan that he notes here is exactly what happens to him inside of Yuji's domain. After this little brainstorm, Sukuna flips his arm from the armbar that Yuji had on him and proceeds to try and use a cleave on Yuji. However, this blow never actually activates due to Yuta using case speech and stopping his movements. Landing a second thin icebreaker on Sukuna, he's sent flying away, where Rika lands a punch against him and proceeds to hammer fist him down to the ground. Yuta and Yuji sprint towards where Sukuna landed, but Sukuna responds with a dismantle against the both of them, pushing both Yuji and Yuta back as Rika continues the assault and attacks Sukuna from above. Catching the punch and kicking Rika in the face, it's also important to know that right here, Sukuna has actually healed the wound sustained from the original Shikigami, because we don't see the slashes on his back here. And also in a previous panel, we see a brief amount of smoke coming from Sukuna, indicating the usage of RCTs. Always pay attention to the smoke coming from fighters within these panels here. Now, Sakuka? Who the fuck is Sakuka? While Sukuna has a hold of Rika's hand, he uses cleave to cut her fingers and destroy her hand and make some distance between them. You can see pieces of her fingers flying away here. Now, earlier I mentioned why Sukuna didn't just instantly kill Higuruma. It was due to a multitude of reasons: Sukuna's output, his interest in Higuruma, and also just his toughness alongside Kusakabe. Well, Sukuna references this exact same thing that I talked about earlier, mentioning how if he's not making direct contact, he won't leave a fatal wound, which checks out because so far any slashes he's sent flying without chance or a direct touch have left basically catch scratches, and they are easily healable for the students here. Sukuna is noting a lot of information: his diminished cased energy output due to Gojo, the Jujutsu sorcerer's up defenses, Yuji's reverse case technique, and even how this domain is only targeting him and not Yuji either. Now, realizing all this, Sukuna asks, what is it that you guys have just been up to? And both Yuji and Yuta give the most character accurate answers to date, with Yuta saying, we cheated, and Yuji saying, hard work and determination. And the truth is, neither of them are wrong. They're both technically right here, because Yuta notes that if it wasn't for Gojo, they wouldn't have a spare second to heal, and Sukuna would have annihilated them in an instant. And Yuji notes that right now, they're fighting the strongest sorcerer, as much as it pains him to admit it. Continuing the fight, Rika, Yuji, and Yuta all press forward, with Rika punching Sukuna and Yuji landing 2 more punches, with Yuta grabbing a sword and getting ready to pierce Sukuna. Except what happens here is Yuta actually uses Charles's future sight technique. Now, if you don't remember who Charles is, it's the French guy who actually fought Hikaru way back when. This technique allows the users to see just a few seconds into the future. With Yuta using this, he dodges a strike from Sukuna and proceeds to pop up on the other side of Sukuna, landing an absolutely massive strike on Sukuna. I don't know if it actually is this, but it kind of just looks like he backhands him, so that's quite funny. But Rika strikes the top of Sukuna's head, and Yuji strikes Sukuna with a double palm blow. Now, while he's taking this beating, 2 things are happening. Yuta is flanking Sukuna, searching for a particular sword, and Sukuna is compiling the list of Yuta's case techniques that he has seen so far. Angel's Jacob Ladder, Sky Manipulation, Drove Shikigami, Cursed Speech, and Future Sight. Sukuna is also at the point that he questions if Yuta actually has Limitless, but then reaffirms himself that he shouldn't actually be able to use that without the 6 eyes. Now, this part feels funny for 2 reasons. 1, Sukuna questions if Yuta has access to a technique that he knows will give him trouble, and 2, later, Yuta pulls up with Gojo's body, which is basically just a step above having the Limitless, to be honest with you. That's kind of funny. But on top of this, Sukuna is questioning the techniques he has, only for Yuta to pull out Sukuna's own technique against him. I mean, it's technically Yuji's. I also noticed a mistake here, because if this is technically Yuji's technique that he's used, shouldn't it have scissor marks on him when he gets cut? I don't know, food for thought. Anyway, Yuta covers his attack with Sky Manipulation and stabs through the surface of the sky in order to land this attack, as Sukuna grabs the blade with both hands, and Yuta says the magic word, cleave. While Sukuna is standing here taking in what's just happened, his stomach mouth looks like it's saying, oh boy, you done fucked up now. Speaking of fucked up, by the way, if you've not subscribed, go do so. This video took a ridiculous amount of time to put together, so go and subscribe, because it really does mean a lot. Thank you very much. Anyways, from this point on, Yuta begins some shenanigans, and these shenanigans are what I would love to dive into right now, because since they are set up from the beginning of the fight, I need to hold my tongue for a little minute until the time is right, because they do pay off, and they do come into big time fruition a little bit later on the line. But Yuta asks Sukuna You couldn't find your final finger, could you? And that's where the beginning of the shenanigans begins. From here, Yuji jumps back, landing another blow on Sukuna, with Sukuna noting how the finger must be quite a tasty meal. Anyway, this next batch of panels, it was strongly reminiscent of Yuji and Nanami just fighting with Mahito, just a straight up beatdown. With Yuta palm striking Sukuna's mouth once again, Yuji knees Sukuna in the face, but he gets caught in a headlock and once again takes an incredibly dangerous blow to the stomach and the chest from Sukuna's cleave. But this, he's not going down without a fight because Yuji spits blood into Sukuna's face. Off topic here, but it was this moment right here where that made me sit back when I first read this on time and thought to myself, holy fucking shit. This is a dogfight, like a real dogfight. Insert clip of Joe Rogan going, this is a dogfight, ladies and gentlemen. There's a lot of UFC references in this fucking video, I think. But anyway, not going down without a fight, Yuji does that, and slipping an uppercut through the arms that held Yuji in place, Yuta rocks Sukuna's chin to the sky as Sukuna drops Yuji. With Yuji determined to heal and get back straight into the action, Rika picks up Sukuna and proceeds to launch Sukuna straight into Yuji's Manji kick. However, Sukuna manages to block this, as you can see his hand right here. But it's right here that Sukuna realizes the situation that he's kind of in right now. Whether you want to admit it or not, the pressure Yuji, Yuta, and Rika put onto Sukuna forced him to make a desperate gamble. And thus, he begins to release Hollow Wicker Basket in a desperate gamble to fire off the World Slash. But Yuta's planning shines through once again. Having already accounted for the fact that this happens, Yuji grabs the lower right arm of Sukuna while Rika grabs the top two, leaving only one arm free. He uses this free arm to grab Yuta's skull as Yuta punches into Sukuna's mouth on the stomach and successfully rips out the tongue, while at the same time being pushed back due to Sukuna's slashes that land on his head and his face. Throwing the tongue aside and proceeding to heal his head almost immediately, Yuta grabs the sword and slashes the main mouth of Sukuna, hoping to take his tongue again, but trying to take out options for Sukuna to use the World Slash here. I do think he does take his tongue here, but like, I'm just gonna assume that, you know, does eventually heal this. But Yuta notes how Sukuna's slashes are weakening, and that means he has nothing to fear. He can close the distance, foreshadowing. But Yuta presses on and slashes the free arm of Sukuna clean off, while Yuji makes the blood he spat into Sukuna's face a little bit earlier start to explode. From here, we're given a flashback of Yuji talking about the notes that Yuki Tsukumo had left, and noting that even if souls are mixed together to some degree, they will never ever become one. This information is very, very important due to the game plan that Yuta and Yuji have employed. Yuta planned to use Jacob's ladder on Sukuna, but he needed this information to be certain no harm would come to Megami Soul as a result of this, which is a far cry different from what Gojo was planning. Gojo was just trying to fucking erase that dude from existence, apparently, with fucking the amount of attacks that guy was throwing around. And it's with this we start to see the faintest glimmer of success. For the first time in this fight, Sukuna looks as if he is actually seriously on the back foot. He looks like he's in trouble. With Yuta releasing a maximum output Jacob's ladder on Sukuna now that his Hollow Wicker Basket has dropped. But the onslaught still doesn't stop for Sukuna as Yuta moves to Sukuna's arm that Yuji had hold of, piercing the bicep and slicing downwards from the bicep to split his hand into two halves, which he would just be like flopping about, very freaky. While at the same time, Yuji lands a punch that finally lets him connect to Megami for the first time in over a month since he was taken over by Sukuna. But it's only the spirit that meets Yuji's eyes, as Megami has, by this point in time, Megami had his body stolen while he was on the precipice of finally achieving his goal of rescuing his sister from the Cullen Games, only to find out that that sister wasn't Samiki and instead Yorozu. Then to have Sukuna steal his body and watch Sukuna go and kill Samiki in front of him. Then Megami was to see Gojo just get cleaved in half, the only real father figure that he had in his life, just killed in front of him. So yeah, I would say Megami's soul is kind of broken. I think that's a fair and valid reason to be like, I don't really want to live anymore. But while all this is happening, Sukuna manages to get off a fully chanted slash. Now I want to clarify this part because many people believe that in this panel this was a world slash. However, I heavily disagree. Earlier I talked about the world slash, the conditions needed to use it, and showed two examples. The world slash landed upon Kashimo, which fulfilled all the conditions, and the slash that landed on Higuruma that left room for speculation, but given the context around Sukuna and his interest in Higuruma and him wanting to keep him alive based on his own interests, which Higuruma even notes in chapter 269, I don't believe it is a world slash. And again, you're more than welcome to disagree, but this here slash, this is undoubtedly not a world slash as far as I'm concerned, for many reasons. Number one, the conditions for world slash were not filled. Sukuna wasn't able to use the Ender 10 hand sign due to both of his lower hands being immobilized, with one being cut right down the middle and the other being cut off completely. On top of this, both of Sukuna's top arms were being held in place by Rika, meaning Sukuna couldn't use the Ender 10 hand sign and he couldn't specify the trajectory of the world slash via his palm. But instead, he does with two fingers once again, like he does with Higuruma, and he does, however, manage to use chance in order to boost the output of his slash in order to cut right through Yuta. And it's also important to notice, Sukuna notes that these attacks will only be fatal if he's making contact with the target. He's making contact with Rika, but finally, these slashes go flying out in every other direction. Yuta, the main target, as well as Rika and Yuji, all all taken really serious damage from this, something we don't ever see the Whale Slash ever doing, and honestly I'm not sure he could, because that would be truly overpowered. Imagine just being able to send the Whale Slash flying in every single direction. I do personally believe that it was just a one singular directional slash, but the main target for Yuta was for a main reason of trying to collapse Yuta's domain, the same principle as Gojo and Sukuna trying to damage each other in order to topple each other's domain. And to finally nail the point that this wasn't a World Slash, in this panel where the slashes land, we see Sukuna with no hand signs formed. However, this was all part and parcel of Yuta's plan once again. Yuta purposefully crumbles his domain to let entry for Maki into his domain, as we learn in chapter 252. This plan allows Maki to land a serious blow onto Sukuna's heart in a parallel that closely mirrors Toji and Gojo early on in the series. In the very next chapter, it is revealed that Yuta actually moved the barrier's coordinates. Now, remember how I mentioned Gege's consistency with the locations of characters and relevance to the fights around their locations? Now, Yuta's domain starts here and actually ended up here. It's also here in this flashback where Kusakabe confirms the plan of Yuta to shatter a part of his domain for Maki to enter. And what's more interesting is Gege actually uses real-life locations for the places in his fights, which I'll point out as and when we get to them. For example, where Maki appears, we see Maki getting ready to sprint as Yuta and his domain rumbles. As Kusakabe watches from afar, we see Yuta, Maki, Sukuna, and Rika all here as Maki has stabbed Sukuna. Maki also just looks incredibly sinister here as she stabs Sukuna, while Sukuna smiles ear to ear at his handiwork, cutting Yuta in two, and causing Rika to just burst out into tears. Not cool, man. Not cool. Anyway, we see Rika rushing away with Yuta in hand, as in the background here we see Sukuna stood with Maki, smoke coming from him as he attempts to heal himself, with Kusakabe screaming for Weeby to arrive in order to teleport Yuta out of the battlefield, and from here the fight lands with Maki and Sukuna. Maki continues the assault and tries to slice Sukuna up the middle, however Sukuna steps away to create distance from her, and this sequence felt like Gege sort of trying to recreate Maki's entrance into Naoya's domain. It's a very similar situation here. We also see Yuji in the background on his knees, struggling to keep up as Sukuna pieces together the events that just happened as he begins to heal himself, or tries to at the very least. Noting how Yuta willingly took down the domain, and that was the signal for the students outside to attack. Sukuna notes how Maki was able to pass through the barrier freely, and we've seen many occurrences of this from a heavily restricted user. Toji freely enters Dagon's domain in Shibuya. I mean, I guess, yeah, technically he did do it via an entryway created by Megami, but he also did the same thing to Tengen's barriers in the Hidden Inventory arc. He just walked through those things and he didn't get detected by Tengen. And then Maki did this exact same thing to Naoya during their fight, and Sukuna also notices how his wound from Maki's blade is healing a lot slower than any other wound. Now, this sequence reiterates what was stated during the Soul Liberation Blade's explanation during Maki's fight with Naoya. The Soul Liberation Blade ignores the hardness of everything and cuts the soul directly, but in order to use it at its full potential, the wielder must have a pair of eyes that can see the souls of inanimate objects. Basically, see the soul, see the outline of the soul, vice versa. To add into this, if this blade is wielded by such a person, the wounds imparted cannot be ordinarily healed. That's a very big point. To do so, one would need to be aware of the outline of their own soul in order to do this. This is something Sukuna is now capable of doing, but as a result of being in a body that contained two souls. But because of his fight with Gojo, Sukuna wasn't fully able to heal via RCT. Now in this panel, we see Maki, Sukuna, and Yuji on the floor just over the side here. We see Yuji trying his best to rejoin the fight, but collapsing from his injuries. You see, throughout this fight, Yuji admits, despite his reverse curse technique helping him, he's taken 4 attacks from Sukuna that otherwise would have killed him, but something hasn't healed correctly. Now I covered earlier how Yuji learned RCT and how Choso explained how people like him and Yuji have an easier time doing so based on their bodies. But due to Yuji's inexperience with the reverse curse technique, he'd missed a vital part of his healing, and Choso appears to help him with this. Now he's the only one who could have helped Yuji at this point. No one else in the students was the product of being a cursed womb death painting, or had a body like Yuji similar to Choso. But what I find funny about this interaction here is Choso actually comes in clutch with vital information on how Yuji can heal himself properly. But later down the line, when we get the flashback of him trying to explain how conversions work, he fumbles that shit so hard that Narutoshi Kamo has to step in and help. Maki and Sukuna continue their fight with Maki chasing after Sukuna while he's still healing. By this point, he's still healing his back from Maki's stab and his arm that Yuta had sliced down the middle. Maki lands on the side of a streetlight here that Sukuna throws at the Smatala. Maki dodges this with relative ease, rolling in front of Sukuna and slashing at his legs. Sukuna jumps the attack, and also, as you can see here, the cut-off streetlight appears in the background. Again, more prevalence to Gege being aware of his surroundings surroundings, but Sukuna grabs the blade. Now, it's my own personal theory here, but I like to believe that Sukuna didn't just grab a blade he knows can cause damage that takes a long time to heal with his hand, with his bare hand, so he tried to use that chainsaw thing again. It's probably my own headcanon, but that's what I would like to think about this. But it doesn't matter regardless, because Sukuna tries to pull the blade from Maki, and instead just gets ragdolled and is thrown on his head and thrown around. And this panel heavily reminded me of when Toji did this exact same thing to Maki back in Shibuya. Throwing Sukuna into the side of a bridge, Sukuna uses cleave on the side of the bridge and throws the chunks of rubble towards Maki. As Maki knocks the rubble out of her way, we hear Sukuna chanting to power up a dismantle to fire at Maki. And it's also worth mentioning that again, this slash is also not a world slash. Once again, due to Sukuna not having met the requirements for this attack, he doesn't have both his arms at the bottom here to do this. But we can see here 2 arms sticking out, meaning Sukuna wasn't doing the Eten hand sign. Thus, this dismantle was just a fully charged one. But Maki dodges this regardless, and from here, the second time in this fight, Sukuna is mildly impressed by Maki's abilities, knowing how Maki can see his technique much better than the other sorcerers, and it's just like his fight with Maharaga. Remember, Sukuna was truly excited that Maharaga could indeed see his Gear's technique, something even Gojo himself seems shocked by having it fired at him. Maki also notes how right now Sukuna is forcibly pumping his heart with Gear's energy while healing himself at the same time. And it looks like Megami was serious about that juvenile detention center thing. Now, this is a callback to Sukuna ripping out Yuji's heart during his fight with Megami, but somehow still managing to live. For the first time in this fight since Gojo, someone talks a little bit of shit to Sukuna, which I honestly was truly happy about, that it was actually Maki. It felt like it was a perfect way for her to do this kind of thing, asking Sukuna if he's going to try and keep this up while he's fighting her. Now, Sukuna replies, I don't see why not. I've hardly broken a sweat. And he's not wrong, because throughout this manga, throughout this fight here, sweat is often used to show the nervousness of a character, or like they're trying here, and Sukuna genuinely has barely been shown with any of that shit on him. It's all just blood, which is insane. But once again, we switch over to Hikari versus Urayumi, and I'm not going to go back into my rant of missed opportunities here, but almost everything in the area is frozen completely solid. Buildings are covered in ice, the air is misty, and Urayumi and Hikari stand almost at a stalemate. Hikari does, however, have a block of ice frozen over on his shoulder and his arm here, as Hikari mentions how Sukuna's cursed energy is kind of taking a real nosedive here, and declaring that they'll be the victors here. He really did just hit the Naride win. But Urayumi in the Shakespeare pretty much tells Hikari, you don't know shit. Telling Hikari that if Sukuna's interest in his opponent is tenuous, then so too will be the waves of his cursed energy. And then saying, to think, you could not present anyone greater than Gojo Satoru. You should be ashamed. Declaring Sukuna has yet to go all out. Now, this is a subject that I kind of want to dive into briefly, but I do believe that it deserves its own video. But I've touched on Sukuna's interest in his opponents and how it often leads him into bits of bother. But this statement from Urayumi genuinely makes me wonder just what a battle from Sukuna truly going all out looks like. We're talking like full form, both Kamatoki and Hiten, and I wonder what kind of monsters in the Heian era sort of rose to fight him that pushed him to do that, if Urayumi has already seen that. Speaking of monsters, we're given more lore on Kusakabe, whom is everyone who seems to regard as one of the strongest grade 1 sorcerers. I mentioned earlier how his analytical skill, and he just arrives at the battlefield and he's just good at what he does. All except Kusakabe himself, who, when asked who's the strongest grade 1, Kusakabe responds, someone other than me or Usami. Now, you might be wondering, just who the fuck is Usami? Well, Usami was, according to multiple people, he's a very abrasive individual, and unless you ask Mei, very weird, but yeah, Gege actually introduced Usami in a volume extra. He's a grade 1 sorcerer that just appears out of nowhere, just never seen again. Anyways, we see Maki hurdling another slash from Sukuna and continuing to attack. This bend in the highway here is also a very real place. The slash Maki dodges actually cuts a building in half behind them, as that falls on top of them as the two interlock, with Sukuna crossing his arms to block Maki's swords. Again, if I had to guess how Sukuna blocks these attacks, I'd place my money on the mini chainsaw technique thing again. Either that or Sukuna's blocking in a way that allows him to avoid the blade, I guess. But the building crumbles on top of both Sukuna and Maki, with cars going everywhere. Maki steps back to create space, but Sukuna uses the cover of this car to cloak his approach to fire off at the dismantle. Maki notices this and turns to slice through the car, but both Sukuna and Maki's strike cause the car to explode and sends Maki flying into the building, with her blocking the damage with the broadside of her sword from Sukuna's slash. Crashing through a window, Sukuna is already inside of the building that Maki just got sent into, ready to attack from behind and Maki's blind spot, landing a direct hit on Maki's stomach before she can react. Enter Ino. The shiesty sorcerer appears on Sukuna's blind side, charging up an attack that he doesn't even get off, as Sukuna just simply turns to mog him, sends dismantles flying his way, and you can actually see Ino's attack dissipating here, which I thought was kind of interesting. But you also see Sukuna's foot about to connect with Ino's sternum, causing him to cough up blood and be kicked out of the building. However, Sukuna notices that Ino wasn't with the curse tool that he was using earlier, only to find out that Kusakabe stood on the floor above with him about to smash through the floor, only for Sukuna to block the incoming strike. Punching Kusakabe into a wall, Maki reappears, attacking and pushing Sukuna through a set of double doors into the next room. Now, these panels, when I first read them, left me mildly confused, but if you turn the perspective of the panels, you can see the image clearly, because Maki enters the room from these doors here, and then stops right here in order to slam herself into a wall that Sukuna makes contact with. This slam causes a shockwave to travel through the wall and slam Sukuna into the wall that is opposite them. From here, Maki slices all 4 columns in the rooms with Maki vowing to crush Sukuna right here and right now. From here, the narrator kicks in, explaining how many people stood before Sukuna, each representing the peaks of Jujutsu sorcery. However, they amount to nothing more than appetizers for the beast, who was truly roused. His hunger was none other than Maki Zenin, who had abandoned Jujutsu by means of heavenly restriction, and this brought the King of Curses to ecstasy. Maki proceeds to kick the slashed columns towards Sukuna. However, Sukuna proceeds to move at the speeds that not even caught by Maki's eyesight, and it caught her completely off guard, grabbing her by the face with a grip strong enough to rip a chunk out of it as she was thrown from the building onto the highway that they stood on earlier. Crashing down onto the highway, Sukuna proclaims that at its core, sorcery is all skin and flesh, but Maki is all bone and marrow, and what Maki represents is the denial of what it means to be a sorcerer. This outcome of the fight will prove which is worth developing, sorcery or body. And I want to put a little pin in this tangent here for a little bit later because it's very interesting. But Maki notes how Sukuna has stopped healing his body, while at the same time Sukuna now declares that this is a first. Maki was and is the only one to have ever forced a role upon him. From this, Sukuna unleashes a black flash, the first one that he has delivered in the entire series of Jujutsu Kaisen, and it was against Maki fucking Zenin. Maki Zenin got Sukuna so fucking heated that he hit a black flash, something even Gojo himself didn't get Sukuna to do, which is interesting in and of itself. But something I do want to point out here is that it wasn't 3 black flashes, but it's only 1, taken from 3 different perspectives. A lot of folk confuse this for 3, but no, this is just 1. You can see Maki is in the exact same position in all 3 panels here, but it's just 3 different perspectives. This leaves only Kusakabe left to fight against Sukuna. Again, another place in real life that Gege uses right here. In chapter 254, we see the depth and power of Kusakabe alongside the simple domain. Chapter 254 has been a big point of reference within this video, as it confirms a few things not only through Sukuna's actions, but also his statements made. Nonetheless, taking in a big, deep breath, Kusakabe crouches down and activates Evening Moon Sword Drawing. Throughout the series, Kusakabe has been shown along with Miwa in order to convey different ways to use the new Shadow style simple domain, both demonstrating Bato Swords Drawing, but now Kusakabe introduces us to the Evening Moon Sword Drawing. What's the difference? Who fucking knows? It's never actually fully explained. But Kusakabe does note that with this simple domain, haste energy will gain an output boost, while Sukuna's abilities will weaken somewhat. We see this at the beginning of the fight with Kusakabe when he saves Higuruma, how he manages to survive Sukuna's slashes. As I explained earlier, it's a combination of Kusakabe's simple domain, Sukuna's technique being weakened, Sukuna's interest in Higuruma, but also the newly strengthened cursed energy of the students. Kusakabe mentions how within this domain, he can intercept anything that invades his simple domain completely and utterly automatically, something Sukuna seems somewhat surprised with when he fires the first slash. Furthermore, Kusakabe mentions how by focusing on Sukuna's movements, his cursed energy sparks, this should improve things. Right after saying this, however, Kusakabe is caught completely off guard by a slash that is fired at him by Sukuna, who didn't even move a muscle and apparently didn't even reduce or create a spark. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Sukuna is constantly playing with the students within this fight. There is a constant worry that Sukuna will fire off a world slash because remember, the students don't really have an idea of what the conditions are for Sukuna to do so. They just know eventually a strong fucking slash is going to hit them and it might kill them fully. In fact, throughout this fight, I'm pretty sure it's only Yuta and Kusakabe who mention the world slash and its possible conditions for activation. Later on, Yuji sort of mentions it, but he also says he can't use his hand sign, and I think Yuji's mentioning his domain here. And in this fight, Sukuna tries to fuck with Kusakabe after catching him off guard with this strike by asking him, guess what's next? The mental warfare in this fight goes crazy with Sukuna. From here, we are given more on the flashback that we saw at the beginning of chapter 253, where Nanami, Meimei, Gojo all talk about Kusakabe's strengths, with Nanami noting that Kusakabe's mastery of the sword, barrier techniques, along with his abundance of knowledge as well as his analytical power, Kusakabe for everybody else would be a formidable opponent when you really think about it. But sadly, he's fighting Sukuna. Expanding the range of his simple domain, he interrupts Sukuna's energy from charging up his world slash. However, from here, Kusakabe dashes forth and starts to slice up Sukuna many times. The blade that Kusakabe is using breaks, and it's hard to determine whether it broke from Kusakabe overcharging it with energy or from attacks similar to what happened to Yuta in Jujutsu Kaisen 0, or if it was Sukuna that broke the blade. Who knows? Let me know in the comments what you think. I'm more actively imagining that it's probably Sukuna who broke the blade, but without missing a beat, Kusakabe pulls off his jacket and covers himself from Sukuna to cloak his next move, throwing the jacket in Sukuna's face, parrying Sukuna's hand and punching him in the face with a 1-2 combo. Sukuna slashes the jacket in half to free his own vision. However, Kusakabe is a step ahead, kicking Sukuna and sending him flying further down the highway that they were on earlier, chasing Sukuna further and further down the highway, leaping into the air and parrying Sukuna's top left hand while landing 2 body shots on Sukuna. While all of this happens, Kusakabe wonders why he's trying just so damn hard and is reminded of Yaga, saying how he owes him one. Now, this detail is one of the most overlooked details in the entire series, and it also ventures into a story point that I wish JJK explored more of, but this video is about details and not about my wants and needs of the story. Back in chapter 147, it's actually revealed that Kusakabe is indebted to Masamichi Yaga due to the fact that he'd created a cursed corpse of his nephew in an effort to help his sister overcome her grief. Again, this is a little plot point, in my opinion, that was truly never explored properly, and given how JJK explored Panda further in the epilogue, if there ever did come a time of him possibly creating a part 2 of Jujutsu Kaisen, cursed corpses is something I'll definitely love to see more of, and potentially even be a villain, maybe, who knows. But this point is the reason why Kusakabe fights so hard, because he owes it to Masamichi not to run and abandon the very students he once was responsible for. In the same way Masamichi put his livelihood on the line for Kusakabe, he is now doing the same thing. Also, bonus fact, Tengen actually knew all about that. Tengen knew everything that Masamichi did with that case corpse. It said that Tengen protects that forest, which is kind of interesting. Jumping over more of Sukuna's slashes, he notes how if he doesn't fight and is taken out now, Sukuna will kill Miwa and all the remaining players. The kids have fought with their lives on the line. What kind of adult would I be if I didn't charge to my death just the same? Unveiling a new shadow style technique known as Moonlight Veil, this technique is very, very similar to what Maki's dad used against her in their fight, attempting to pierce the heart of Sukuna once more, and Sukuna catches the blade with simple 2 fingers and cuts Kusakabe down, basically saying that was kind of predictable. Once again, Wee appears in order to save the fallen soldier here. Notably, this time he appears without Kirara in tow, who was possibly there at the beginning and the first time there to ensure Sukuna wasn't able to get close with their technique. If you remember, when Yuji and Megami go to fight Hakari, Kirara's there and she kind of uses basically a discount version of Infinity. Once again though, Sukuna is painted in a black silhouette. The last time we saw this again was against Maki, and it was done to convey not only the intensity of Sukuna but also his speed. And again, given how he just randomly appears behind Wee here, I'd venture to say that JJK wanted to convey that same intensity and speed again. However, a face from the past actually appears in order to save Wee. Miguel O'Dual steps in to go toe-to-toe with Sukuna. Not just that, but one of Geto's old crew members has actually joined the fight. LaRue also appears to lend a hand, and that hand is one that is holding Kusakabe like an action figure right now. It's actually quite a big hand. Also in this panel, we see the oval-shaped building here. As I've mentioned, the environments in this fight multiple times, but the next couple of chapters pretty much exclusively take place inside of this glass oval slash building, which by the way is known as the Tokyo Opera City Tower. Last year I made a thread on Twitter going through the locations, which is the images that I've used within this video. But we get a flashback of Miguel walking and talking with Yuta, remembering that Yuta had spent some time with Miguel under the instruction of Gojo in order to do some training, but Yuta asks Miguel if he will join the fight, to which he just says no, only to later change his mind, and he will only fight Sukuna under the conditions that Sukuna has been fought after Gojo and Yuta have lost and Sukuna's domain is inoperable. Both Miguel and LaRue note how Sukuna now stands with a weakened reverse curse technique, a lower left arm missing, the lower right not suited for battle, and an unhealed heart. Sukuna begins his assault, slashing the top of the building that Miguel and LaRue stand atop, with Wee having taken Kusakabe and left. Bouncing from the walls down into the Tokyo Opera House, Sukuna follows only to be grabbed by the giant hand LaRue wields. Smashing Sukuna into a wall, LaRue's hand reveals a small slash, as a result of Sukuna slashing through the bigger hand holding him against the wall. Now you can see that slash mark right here. Punching LaRue away, Sukuna turns his attention to Miguel, sending a barrage of slashes in his direction, and Miguel, much like Maki, dodges these slashes with ease. Dodges is an understatement, by the way. Miguel basically looks as if he's just breakdancing through these motherfuckers. He is emoting on Sukuna right now. As Miguel dodges a kick meant for him, Sukuna kicks up the rubble that flies towards LaRue, who pulls himself out of the way with his own curse technique. He uses his own hand to grab him out of the way, which is kind of interesting. But this is where LaRue's technique is explained, known as heart catch. LaRue can grip a target and even if destroyed, can be recreated an indefinite amount of times with only 1/10 of the damage being transferred to LaRue's body. For example, earlier when the hand was slashed into, only LaRue's hand took a small cat scratch basically, and Sukuna notes how he's not particularly interested in the flavors of that technique, but Miguel's on the other hand, now that's a flavorful technique. Miguel's curse technique, known as Hakuna Lana, the beat etched by the body expels curses and enhances his own physical capabilities. This curse technique basically makes him a budget fusion of the inverted spear and heavenly restriction when you start to think about it. While this technique is explained, Miguel literally is shook shuffling like a boxer in front of Sukuna. He really is hitting that Ali shuffle right there. There's a lot of fight references within this, and I feel like as a fight fan, I sort of ate good throughout this. It's quite interesting. I also at first didn't actually notice that he was shuffling. I just thought he was just like sort of like bouncing up and down. I didn't see the little exclamation marks for his legs there. But we get a flashback to when Gojo visited Yuta and Miguel in Africa, where Gojo explains how Miguel's technique shoots off buffs and debuffs without the need for a Domin expansion. Going on to say, if him and Miguel were to have a fight with just reinforcement and no techniques, Miguel would win the sprint, but Gojo the marathon. Meaning in a short burst of rush here, Miguel is extremely threatening, even to the likes of Gojo. We cut back to the present to see Miguel and Sukuna throwing hands, and for the first time in the series, Sukuna looks like he's the lesser fighter here when it comes to hand-to-hand. Parrying both Sukuna's strikes, Miguel lands a body shot on Sukuna's wound here where Maki had stabbed him, even grabbing his wrist and striking him with an elbow to the chest. And it's at this point Choso reappears to fire off a piercing blood at Sukuna, who simply sidesteps and returns fire with a quick slash that lands on Choso's arms and shoulders. Meanwhile, Yuji crashes down from the glass ceiling to hammer fist Sukuna, only for Sukuna to say, "Are you still around?" It is truly phenomenal just how much Sukuna hates this man Yuji within the series. It's actually phenomenal. Much like the Kusakabe chapter, I've referenced this chapter many times throughout the video, as it's this chapter that sort of serves as the halfway mark within the showdown, and it only serves to show Yuji finally starting to pull up, and it also confirms the conditions and therefore the events of the world slash that landed on Gojo. As I've explained many times within this video, and I'm sure you're just sick of hearing it, the world slash requires multiple steps to activate. 1. The Enma 10 hand sign used for Malevolent Shrine. 2. Chance. And 3. The trajectory of the technique must be specified via his palm. As this is told to us, we are given the perspective of one Maki Zenin, who is zooming into the fight, and we can see the speed lines drawn on the walls and the floor that someone is approaching. This is the perspective of Maki, and in the next panel, Maki cuts off Sukuna's top left arm. With this action, Maki now ensures that he can no longer use the world slash at this time, and he can also now officially no longer use his domain expansion via his regular hand sign of the Enma 10. Sukuna is also surprised at Maki's durability, as even after being hit by a black flash, she has still reappeared. Not only this, but Sukuna's arm that was cut by Maki will now also take a longer time to heal, as it was cut by the Soul Liberation Blade. However, this is where things are looking up. Sukuna goes and lands a second black flash, just as things were starting to look up on LaRue, because fuck LaRue. With the narrator kicking in just to let us know, with a second black flash, Gojo Satoru's reverse curse technique output had restored. But things are different for Sukuna. However, we'll put a pin in this for the time being. We're in a flashback-like interview sequence for Gojo explaining how he thinks a black flash can happen. Fun fact, in the official translations, Gojo says that he can't use black flash, and it's because of his 6 eyes. Yeah, average Viz translation moment there. But anyway, Gojo goes on to explain how people say the black flash is a distortion of space that occurs when a physical strike and cursed energy land within 0.000000001 seconds of each other. I don't know how many zeros there, I lost count, but there's a lot of zeros. Anyway, which he disagrees with, because if that was the case, he would be able to land them at will. Remember, Gojo's control of cursed energy is just infinitely better than anyone else in the series, up there with Sukuna's easily, and that is obviously due to the 6 eyes. But Gojo goes on to say how there are 3 types of punches with cursed energy. 1, the type that will strengthen his fist. 2, the type that will crash into his opponent, and 3, the type that will do both. Now, Gojo goes on to explain how it's not even like anyone can control the 3rd type except for him, and on top of things like changes in the environment, the opponent's physical condition, or even their own cursed energy. But Gojo says something interesting here, because Gojo believes that there is some connection between temperature and humidity that sparks a black flash. Then finalizing his point how there's realistically no correct answer on how to unleash a black flash. But given all the context throughout the series though, I do believe it's a combination of everything that Gojo says. We get back into the fight with everyone noting how Sukuna just hit a second black flash. And the first thing on everyone's minds is that he might actually regain his reverse curse technique just like Gojo did. While at the same time, they're all also wondering who Miguel is, because remember, everyone here doesn't know. They've never seen Miguel before, except for Yuta, but obviously Yuta's not here. Now the fight continues with Maki, Choso, and Yuji all surrounding Sukuna. Maki slashing Sukuna here and Choso kicking up the fence in order for Yuji to grab said fence and pin Sukuna to a wall. As Yuji is preparing to do this, we see Maki's blade applying pressure, trying to stab Sukuna, trying to lunge at him basically. Now Choso jumps into the air as Sukuna is pinned to the wall by Yuji, firing off his piercing blood. Sukuna manages to escape, but I want to point out how in this panel, Choso is above Sukuna and somewhat close, but in the next one, once he's fired, the piercing blood is a lot higher up. Now I would be willing to bet that this is due to the explosive firing power of piercing blood propelling Choso higher into the air, I guess. Now Sukuna backs further into the building to create space, and Maki flanks Sukuna from the sides and bursts through these glass doors in order to stab Sukuna. Now there's a small panel here that shows Sukuna using slashes, which we then see are slashes above Maki Maki to drop the ceiling on top of them. From here, both Sukuna and Maki jump on air throughout the rubble while fighting, with Choso asking what the fuck is with that movement. They're using the air as footing itself. Now, this isn't the first time that we see this. You see in Shibuya, we actually see Sukuna doing the same thing against Jogo, and right here he knocks Jogo, and then he bounces off the air to catch up to him and grab him by the face. And Maki also bounces off the air during her fight with Naoya, and in the volume extras here, Gege mentions how he wanted this to be something that really strong sorcerers can do. He explains that Sukuna was able to do this, but in addition, Sukuna was able to create small bursts of cursed energy that allowed him to move even faster than Maki or Toji. However, it's not like the surface of the space is just everywhere, it's fluid and it's making the paths limited. Gege depicts this same detail here in his fight with Maki and Naoya. The way he draws this panel, Maki even mentions how these facets are scattered everywhere before she grabs onto them. So people who can see this can move around, but it's limited. However, once again, with a massive smile on his face, Sukuna is fighting against Maki. In a panel that almost mirrors his first Black Flash on here again, he lands a third Black Flash on Maki. With this Black Flash, he now follows up a couple of slashes that Maki deflects with her blade, and she notes that even his output for his base slashes is now starting to increase. As Sukuna prepares to fire more slashes on Maki, Choso sends 6 orbs of supernova behind Sukuna. Detonating them, Sukuna uses the smoke as cover to send slashes at Choso, and then proceeds to move faster than those slashes can reach Choso. Now, if I had to take a guess, I would probably argue he's using the aforementioned airwalking with cursed energy boost that I've just talked about to get here fast. Dragging Choso and throwing him into the wall and following up with a 4th Black Flash. A Black Flash that Choso actually manages to dampen by armor from his own blood. Blood that came from his mouth and his hands, as you can see it pouring out of his mouth here. And moving in to protect the Choso, Yuji lands a clean hit on Sukuna, knocking him back. Also in this panel, Sukuna still has the blood armor on it that Choso just created. As I mentioned earlier, Yuji isn't capable of using blood manipulation's convergence effectively to create a piercing blood, but Choso also mentions how every time Yuji lands a blow, it will weaken the cursed energy output of Sukuna that he has slowly been regaining. Passing Yuji a condensed ball of convergence, LaRue comments how there is still one more thing that he can do, and as Yuji and Sukuna burst through a wall, they continue fighting, with Yuji throwing a knee at Sukuna that is blocked by Sukuna's stumps on his left arms, while at the same time Sukuna uses punches that are imbued with slashes. Remember how I mentioned the similarities between Sukuna and Gojo earlier? Yeah, this is kind of one of them. Gojo used to imbue his fist with blue at the same time, and now Sukuna is imbuing his fists with his curse technique. It's very interesting how it's all working out. But Sukuna isn't the only one, because he grabs Yuji by the collar trying to throw him, but Yuji keeps a hold of Sukuna in a manner very similar to Gojo once again, firing the red into Sukuna's face, but this time it's Yuji firing a point-blank piercing blood. I also want to point out that from the moment that Yuji was given this piercing blood from Choso here, he keeps his fist clenched the entire time to preserve its condensed form, which Choso explains how Yuji can't use convergence effectively yet, which is why he needs to keep looking after them. Off topic, but man, I genuinely fucking love Choso's character. This dude is easily one of the best characters within the series. If you want to see a video on him, check this one out. Also, let me know your favorite character in the comments down below. It's always great. But Yuji fires off a piercing blood that narrowly grazes Sukuna, but at the same time, Sukuna lets go of Yuji and hits him with a slash across the face and shoulder. Now, as the two have space between each other, Yuji readies his next attack. An attack that at that moment gave Sukuna the premonition of an oncoming Black Flash, similar to Mahito way back in Shibuya. But at this moment, LaRue's final act, that one thing that he can do, hits Sukuna, drawing his attention to him, a technique that can only happen if LaRue manages to grip you with his main technique, allowing for Yuji Itadori to land the first of his many Black Flashes on Sukuna, and thus unleashing his potential with a single blow. Beneath the scattering sparks of black, Yuji Itadori awakens. From this point on in the fight, Yuji's eyes change completely. In fact, they change before this Black Flash even hits. And this change wasn't even just an aesthetic choice from Gege here. This is in fact a subtle tell to tell you that Yuji's curse technique had just woke up. It got up out of its bed for this one. But this isn't actually the first time that we've seen Yuji's eyes like this. You see, way back in chapter 214, Gege subtly changed Yuji's eyes for the duration of his fight with Sukuna, briefly at moments here. But his eyes only stay in that state right up until Yuji decides to try and talk to Sukuna. And then once again, they change back as he marches towards Sukuna through his slashes, and this was Gege's extremely subtle way of letting us know just what is coming. From here on, we get a lot of information in regards to Yuji's heritage. Ryomen asks Sukuna just what is Yuji, to which Sukuna tells her he is Kenjaku's child, but I couldn't tell you from which body. Remember, Kenjaku has had many bodies. In fact, we've never actually seen his original body. Every time we've seen Kenjaku within the series, he's had stitches on his forehead, but also at this point, Sukuna wasn't active when Yuji was born. As I mentioned earlier, Gege gave us early hints of Yuji's impending power, and Urumi also notes notes this as we're given a little flashback to the exact same moment that I referred to earlier, where Urumi notes she felt something from him that was deeply reminiscent of Sukuna. Sukuna notes how the one Jaku coupled up with was likely a fragment of myself, reincarnated. Our souls are the same. Which is where the big reveal happens that Sukuna was indeed supposed to be a twin and was forced by his mother's blight to consume that twin in the womb, but that twin's soul aimlessly bounced around until it fell into Kenjaku's hand, and Sukuna further confirms that Yuji was bred to be a player in the Culling Games, already having one of his fingers sealed within him. Now, this explains Yuji's strength as a vessel, and also why Yuji was just able to survive consuming the fingers of Sukuna way back at the beginning of the series. But it's also confirmed by Gege in a volume extra. There was actually Yuji's grandpa, who was the twin of Sukuna, and not Yuji's dad, which was a bit of a confusion here, but that was cleared up in a volume extra. We move back into the fight of Yuji v Sukuna, and this panel is framed as an almost mirror image of both Yuji and Sukuna staring each other down. Sukuna makes the first move, lunging an open hand towards Yuji, with Yuji parrying Sukuna's hand and landing the second black flash of this fight upon Sukuna. A black flash that lands directly into the sternum of Sukuna and thus the wound that Maki left on him. Sukuna grabbing his arm, elbowing it down, and then proceeds to counter with his own black flash. How do we know this is a black flash? Well, Sukuna is connecting with his stumps here, but also in the next panel, Yuji is sent flying through the glass barrier. If this was a black flash from Yuji, Sukuna probably would have been the one that was getting knocked back here. Yuji lands onto this column where it's revealed that Yuji actually has access to cleave, or at least his own version of cleave. Yuji touches this column and we see scissor marks appear. Digging his claws into the column, Yuji proceeds to throw the column at Sukuna. Now, while all this is happening, we're given an explanation as for what is happening with Yuji. There are currently two curse techniques residing within Itadori Yuji. The first is blood manipulation, engraved by absorbing the curse wound death patterns 4 through till 9. Now, in chapter 142, Choso tells us that he is the eldest brother of 10 siblings. However, we only get to beat Eso and Kechizo, and obviously Yuji. But did you know in chapter 144, Choso actually slyly gives us the names of these younger brothers? Naranso, Shouoso, Tanso, Sanso, Kotsuo, and Shoso. And in this very same chapter, we actually see Choso touching the warehouse where those remaining brothers are stored. Now, a lot later down the line, we see Yuji thanking Choso, with Choso saying, "It's okay. It's as if they can go living on as a part of you, Yuji." Ironically, both Yuji and Sukuna consume their siblings in an effort to survive. I find that quite funny. Now, the second technique drawn out by the awakened state, achieved through Black Flash, was the same technique engraved upon the reincarnated body of Ryomen Sukuna. Right. Cutting back to the fight, Sukuna dismantles the column that Yuji throws at him, and Sukuna kicks Yuji's fist. Now, I also want to point out here that this is the first time in the fight where we see Gauntlet actually take damage. For the most part of the fight, Yuji's gauntlets have been sort of deflecting and tanking slashes from Sukuna, which is very interesting. But Yuji grabs Sukuna's leg and begins to dismantle his leg, and Sukuna returns fire with his own dismantle, one that Yuji simply eats to the face and proceeds to land his third black flash onto Sukuna. Sukuna notes how this technique is the same as his, but due to the era and the sorcerer using it, it brings about a sizable disparity. As his leg is cut, he notes that a freshly learned curse technique means low output, but what's more troublesome are these blows. Remember, so far, Yuji has landed 3 black flashes on Sukuna, and each punch has also struck the outline of Sukuna's soul, lowering his own output and control over Megami's body. And we're given a flashback to Ino talking to Gojo, Shoko, and Ichiji about whether he can use Nanami's curse tool. And it's right after this that we finally get to see Ryu, the 4th auspicious beast from Ino. A beast that almost Sukuna into a wall, only for it to be completely and utterly mincemeated in seconds. However, Ino wastes no time dropping to the floor below and trying to uppercut Sukuna with the curse tool. However, Sukuna is simply just stomps on the tool and stops this from happening, jamming it between his foot and the floor. But this occurrence allows Yuji to land a 4th black flash on Sukuna, one that Sukuna manages to block, but any hit from Yuji at this point is still causing damage to Sukuna's soul and control of his body. So even if he blocks it, it's still just hitting him at damage. It's still basically just blowing past his guard. It's at this point where we start to see Sukuna lose his composure. Even against Gojo, we never really saw an outburst like what's about to come. Even when it was framed as him being nervous, he still didn't sort of just lose control and scream at Gojo like this. Sukuna notes how Yuji is chaining black flashes together like it's nothing. Does this dude intend to climb up to my level? Now, Yuji punches Sukuna through some windows as we see Ino tapping out on the floor and exclaiming, "This is just way out of my league," which that's pretty based. It is. It's way above your pay grade. As Yuji follows Sukuna through the windows, Sukuna cleaves the floor below and proceeds to punch Yuji. Similar to earlier, Sukuna is combining punches and slashes into one attack, and we see the punch landing here and blood being drawn as Yuji grabs onto Sukuna's arm. Yuji punches Sukuna onto a wall, and even Sukuna notes how Yuji's just completely unfazed by his combinations of strikes and slashes. Then the more slashes Yuji's way, Yuji is doing his best Korean zombie impression here and just marches forward and proceeds to land the 5th Black Flash on Sukuna, clean into the stomach. Now, Sukuna grabs Yuji by the right side of his face and cleaves, heavily damaging Yuji's face and destroying his right eye. However, once again, unbothered and unfazed, Yuji's counterattack with the 6th Black Flash of the fight right into Sukuna's face, and we see Sukuna's face bleeding as he screams "You brat" at Yuji, and we later see how Sukuna's mask here was actually broken and cracked by this punch, which also, by the way, in one of the volume extras, Sukuna is actually telling us that this mask is a bone defect and it's itchy, which is mildly unsettling, to be honest with you. Having an itchy bone structure on your face really is creepy. Now, in the middle of Sukuna's tantrum here, Ino strikes and hits Sukuna with the Case tool, once again setting Yuji up for his 7th Black Flash of this fight. A clean Black Flash right into the back of Sukuna. Now, earlier I covered the theory of Gojo's explanation of Black Flashes and how he thinks it's something to do with temperature and humidity, and it's interesting to note that Yuji has hit some of his most pivotal Black Flashes in the series while being surrounded by a body of water, something that can affect the temperature and humidity of a room. Coincidence? Maybe, but still fun to point out regardless. Speaking of Gojo, it's revealed in chapter 258 that after hitting 2 Black Flashes, Gojo was able to establish a unique reverse Case technique relay in an awakened state. What set this relay apart was the operation and burden of the technique being dispersed through separate regions of his brain, meaning Gojo, rather than using a part of his brain reserved for RCT, he somehow managed to figure out a separate path for it, allowing him to use RCT and regain his missing arm. Now, there was a theory a little while ago that I saw on Twitter about how Gojo possibly began to use the part of the brain pertaining to the optic lobe of his brain, as Gojo's eyes can take on a large amount of information. Possibly it. Again, it's only a theory, and there is no other statements within the series that have that sort of prove or disprove that, but it's interesting to think about nonetheless. Sukuna should have by now also been able to heal his severed hands and crush the Jujutsu students, but should being the operative word, due to Yuji's combination of 7 Black Flashes and the fact that these hits landed in the boundary between Sukuna and Megami's soul, Sukuna's hopes of recovering his RCT were trampled. However, the King's domain traveling along the sparks of black returned to its master. Now, I'm not gonna lie, the narration at certain points during the Shinjuku arc are just so crazy. Like, comment below what your favorite narration moment was, because the King's domain traveling along the sparks of black to return to its master is just cold, along with the same thing of Gojo's voltage ramps up. Whew. Cold, man. Regardless, Sukuna's domain takes on an entirely new form. It's as if it's a fusion of Megami's Shikigami and Sukuna's original domain, with 8 eyes around the outside and 1 central in the middle. And it almost looks as if pieces of the Black Flash surround the domain as it manifests in the sky here. Looks like black lightning. As we see Shinjuku being ripped apart, the narrator chimes in once more. By altering the hand signs and utilizing a part of the brain unaffected by Infinite Void, Sukuna employed his Case technique alongside his barrier technique. Amidst a maelstrom of uncertainties and impromptu binding vows, Sukuna's rush of Black Flashes allowed Malevolent Shrine to burst forth once more with no loss in output or range. We see Shinjuku alongside Mei's crows being absolutely eviscerated entirely, and I also want to point out how Sukuna's hands being changed was mentioned here, because while he stood inside of his domain here, we see Sukuna is using the exact same hand sign as Gojo does for his own domain. Remember a little bit ago there I said that we'll see more and more similarities between Gojo and Sukuna as the fight goes on? Add that to the list, and there's more to come, by the way. One of the main reasons that Sukuna ends up having to change his hand sign is probably, if I had to take a guess, the main one being he can't make the Enma-ten hand sign, but it's probably due to the fact that Sukuna uses it the same way that Gojo did in order to change the pathways in his brain to make the domain, potentially. Listen, I've been down a Jujutsu Kaisen rabbit hole now for a couple of days while making this video, so do me a favor, cut me some slack, like and subscribe, because this shit's got my brain fried. I'm just going to let you know it's got my brain fried here. Anyways, we're given a brief flashback of a conversation between the students about who can use reverse Case technique and who can't. Now, I've already gone over this part before when talking about the injuries Yuji sustained after he used his domain, so I'm not going to go over it again, but it's basically an explanation on why people like Yuji and Choso have an easier time with an RCT in comparison to others, but it also offers an explanation into Wee Wee's Case technique that is relevant now. Throughout the fight, Wee Wee has been consistently appearing and disappearing to the fight to rescue the injured away from Sukuna. As I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like integral to the plan. However, Wee Wee's technique can do more than just swap people in and out of places. It's able to target souls and switch them between people as if it's a present in a box that's been unopened, as he describes it, which is how Yuji was able to swap with Kusakabe in order to do his training and learn Simple Domain, and then again with Yuta in order to learn RCT. But I also believe Yuta helped him in teaching Yuji more information on a domain expansion, or at least the very, very basics of it. From here, we are shown Yuji using new shadow style, simple domain. In order to try and survive Sukuna's domain during his simple domain, Yuji notices that Sukuna's domain isn't actually complete, and there must be some opening somewhere, as we see Sukuna's domain literally bleeding from its eyes here, which is very interesting. Also sort of reminds me of Gojo's nose bleeding, or at least that's what it reminded me of anyway. But once again, the narrator kicks into gear. Yuji was correct in his assessment of Sukuna's domain. Even at this 11th hour, Sukuna made no attempt at lowering the complexity of his domain, as was in Shibuya. He offered no restraint to output nor effective range. Furthermore, by enveloping his domain in an outer shell barrier, the binding valve that allows an escape route disappeared. Meaning, Sukuna, instead of having no barrier like he did in Shibuya, had his barrier, but this time he just didn't close it, and thus the escape route disappeared. Remember, in Shibuya, it was explained how Sukuna's domain having no barrier was the result in a binding valve that allowed an escape route from his domain, but allowing this escape route vastly increased the guaranteed hits effective area. But this time, he's using an outer shell barrier, and thus there is no escape route. This is not only resulted in a narrowed range, which in Shibuya was nearly 200 meters, but here it was narrowed down. But this removal of the escape route also changed Sukuna's domain in how it was operated. Within the materialized landscape, the sure hit effect would activate. Now, this wording is slightly confusing, so I'm going to try my best to explain this in as much information as I can possibly. In Shibuya, Sukuna's domain has two modes of attack: the default slash, dismantle, and the other, cleave. Cleave was used for things with cursed energy, and for inanimate objects, dismantle. Now, you might be sat here thinking, okay, well, domains treat Maki as an inanimate object, or more accurately, a building, and you're not wrong. Domains do treat Maki and Toji by extension as a building, which by extension is an inanimate object, so realistically dismantle should be killing here. However, unless the barrier of a domain uses a physical object as its shell, like Megami's domain against Reggie, or unless Maki agrees to the conditions of a domain, intentionally chooses to invade the domain, Maki cannot be trapped inside of a domain, which right now she's not going to agree to these additions, and she didn't definitely choose to invade this domain, she just got caught in it. So by extension, Maki cannot be trapped within this domain. Now, because of this, the domain sure hits have no way to recognize Maki. Now, I hope you're staying with me here, because again, it'll all make sense in a second, but earlier it was mentioned how Sukuna's domain had changed its operation, so that within the materialized landscape, the sure hit effect would activate. The materialized landscape being Sukuna's domain, meaning if you're inside that landscape, you're now a target for the sure hit. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to seize Maki, who was unbound by cursed energy. How could Sukuna do this? I believe this change in domain operation was similar to him expanding his target for the world slash, and he employed a similar tactic to ensure that he could target Maki. However, because of his domain being such a high level at this point right here, Sukuna would only be able to maintain it for 99 seconds, which is another reason that I believe it was a similar tactic to him expanding his cursed technique target. And because of this, because it was his first time doing it, and because of the state that he was in, he could only maintain it for a short period of time. Now, we get to see a massive landscape shot of Shinjuku being ripped apart by Sukuna as if it's in a tornado. Within this midst of this freaking maelstrom here, we see Yuji, Maki, and Miwe, Ino, and Shoso all using simple domains and trying their best to survive. However, Yuji's simple domain ends up crumbling and having been torn to shreds by Sukuna's domain sure hit, even losing a leg as Yuji is sent flying backwards. However, due to Yuji's blood manipulation technique, the leg that he lost was still connected to him via blood, and Yuji dragged this leg back to his body and proceeds to heal it. Now, this was pretty much the exact same thing that Shoso did during his fight with Kenjaku. Also, by the way, remember that flame technique that Sukuna used against Jogo? Yeah, he's about to use it again. But before we get into all of that, we are given a small flashback of Choso, Noritoshi, and Yuji all talking about blood manipulation, and it's basically to give Yuji 1 month crash course on the fundamentals and basics of blood manipulation. Choso, getting excited, tries to explain how convergence works to Yuji and just totally fumbles it. As I mentioned earlier, he fumbles this explanation, but on the battlefield came in clutch with the correct advice to help Yuji heal. But Noritoshi settles on teaching the basics of stopping blood and stitching, both of which we've seen Yuji do during this fight, stitching his leg together in Sukuna's domain and stopping the blood from all of his wounds. How do we know he's stopping the blood? Well, because he hasn't fucking bled out by now. Come on now, please, stay with me here. Come on. This is where we're showing Sukuna aiming the Fairness arrow. Also, by the way, firing an arrow with, like, 2 right hands is kind of impressive in and of itself. We are given a lot of information for how this technique works, along with the science behind it and the conditions to make it work. Sukuna can only open the doors to Fairness after preparing the ingredients with cleave and dismantle. Yeah, there's a lot of cooking-themed stuff here with Sukuna. Realistically, he's just a dude who's a massive foodie who just loves a good scrap. But the narrator continues explaining, despite their absurd firepower, the flames within Fairness lack attack, both speed and range. To amend this, Sukuna undertook another Binding Vow. Outside of his domain, fairness cannot be used on multiple targets. Hence why in Shibuya when fighting Jogo, Sukuna never needed to activate his domain in order to use fairness, because he was only targeting one person, so he could just activate that shit. This Binding Vow enabled Sukuna to not only reduce all within Malevolent Shrine's range to dust, but to ensure that the resultant particles were mattered in an explosive cursed energy akin to fairness. This section refers to the Cleave and Dismantle reducing everything to dust and not fairness, but Cleave and Dismantle leaving behind explosive cursed energy that is like fairness. And on top of this, Sukuna definitely alters the function of the domain to one that only allowed entry to living beings, maintaining the shrine's output whilst sealing it airtight. This part refers to the operation change in the last chapter, where Sukuna now has his domain sure hit activate on everything within the materialized landscape, thus allowing him to target Maki. As the arrow is fired, we see Urumi and Hakari, who don't seem to have moved at all, with Urumi now repeating Hakari's words back to him, saying, "This is actually our victory." Yuji watches on as the arrow lands and destroys everything in Shinjuku, and even more so than when Malevolent Shrine did. It's as if a small nuclear bomb has gone off by the looks of it. It's just insane destruction. Thermobaric explosives and the transformed particle matter rained down on every inch of this domain. The heat of fairness spread the detonations immediately, birthing scalding, instantly compressing and decompressing shockwaves, ensuring the death of all living beings within the domain. An attack capable of instantaneously obliterating Maharag back in Shibuya. This is Sukuna's ultimate move. Now, what I noticed about this attack, from the way that it's described, is it's not just one big explosion, but rather one big one followed by a lot of instant tiny detonations of many more explosions. Kind of like a firework, I guess. The biggest reason Sukuna was never able to unleash this attack on Gojo was due to how many times he changed the conditions for his barrier techniques. The repeated use of Binding Vows to alter his effective range meant that during his battle with Gojo, the Fairness Flames remained cool, as Sukuna didn't have the freedom to unseal its flames. As all of this is happening, Choso sacrifices himself to save Yuji, and it's not shown in this chapter, but later down the line in the official volume release, we actually get to see those final moments from Choso. It's a little bit more fleshed out. But Choso used a Binding Vow in order to transform his whole body into a shell that could protect Yuji from the flames of Sukuna, thus costing him his life. But not before Choso reuniting with Yuji in this dream sequence. Sat at a table, we can see them talking, with Choso apologizing. And honestly, I've said this before, and I'll just say it again, Choso's character is just one of the best and most nuanced characters within the series. He's a top 3 character, I think, in terms of writing for me. And Gege making sure that he was only one of the only people in the series to stay permadead, it stabbed me in the heart. One like equal one prayer for Choso, please and thank you. But regardless of my feelings, we see the scorched earth aftermath of Sukuna's fairness as the barrier protecting Yuji collapses. Now, Yuji questions whether anyone is dead or if they're alive, which is where the narrator kicks in once more. Itadori always told himself that he was nothing but a cog in a machine, that he would fulfill his role as needed. He should have been able to repay his brother and gave his life protecting him. But yet, as his eyes fell upon scorched earth, cool, stale air, and settled dust, he found his conviction shaken to its roots. So a couple of things here. Yuji watches Sukuna appear from the shadows, and we are reminded that Yuji only thinks of himself as a cog, a thing that began in Shibuya and was verbalized first to Hikari during their fight, rather Hikari's beating of Yuji, in which Yuji explains to Hikari he is a cog. He's a cog for sorcerers to continue exercising curses. But it's also a callback to something Sukuna said just before Yuta fell to the battlefield, that he decided to mince Yuji's ideals to bits. And it's at this moment that he was as close to having his ideals as minced as he could have gone if it wasn't for our main man, Ao Todo, entering the fray. That's right. In chapter 259, Todo rejoins the battlefield after being last seen in chapter 133. Over 100 chapters, this dude was just gone. Just disappears. Naturally, Gege being Gege dropped us into a flashback that had Todo explaining his plan to pull people out of the domain should they be caught in it by Sukuna. The plan entailed having crows lurking on the outlines of the barrier created by Sukuna, or in this case the area of destruction. Todo aimed to swap the people trapped within the domain with the crows on the outside. However, to do this, Todo needed to refine his curse technique and extend its effective range quite a bit. It's also revealed that Todo spent some time with Yuta refining his curse technique, a technique that, as I mentioned earlier, was used to help kill Kenjaku. But I hear you ask, how on earth did Todo manage to switch out Maki? Todo has spent time refining his technique, and in chapter 51, way back when, Todo exclaims that his CT works on objects, things such as cursed corpses, and anything with cursed energy over a certain level. Now, in chapter 269, Todo explains how even though Maki isn't a viable target for Boogie Woogie, Miwa acted as a marker for Maki, and we see Miwa inside of the domain alongside Maki, meaning when Todo used his technique on Miwa, he got a 2-for-1 deal with Maki. I'm guessing, and I'm wagering my money here, that Maki was sort of treated like a chaos tool that Miwa was holding onto it, I guess. I will admit that Gege didn't really flesh out this part to be honest with you. In my opinion, I do think it is something that I would have liked a little bit more clarity on it, but hey ho, it's the way of the road, I guess. And also, a little mistake that I noticed here is that even though Todo uses his technique to save everyone, he appears with his arm still bandaged, meaning he couldn't use the Vibra Slap if it was bandaged. Anyway, Todo continues further talking to Mei and explaining how even though Yuji and Sukuna have both been separated, their connection still runs thick. Further mentioning how the mission at the Yasuhachi Bridge was triggered by the finger that Yuji swallowed resonating with one in the wild. Something Gege does many times throughout the series here is to make it clear how much Sukuna and Yuji are connected. Happens all the way through Shinjuku, and it happens many times further on. Whether they like it or not, Sukuna's actions affect Yuji just as Yuji's actions affected Sukuna when they were sharing the same body. And throughout Shinjuku, we see Sukuna grappling with this, a conversation that he has with himself just before Yuta lands. Yuji and Sukuna, they were two sides of the one coin, and throughout this, they have lived a shared experience, and this is something Todo suggests might cause a problem. Todo suggests that due to their connections, Yuji might unintentionally reveal key details of the plan to Sukuna. Now, many people took this as something that definitely can happen, although it's never been shown to happen, and it's even said later on by Yuta. I always interpreted this as Todo just being overly cautious to the situation with Sukuna and tried not to have any sort of holes in the plan here. Now, we switch back to the present with Todo for the first time, unsure in his advice as he gives it to Yuji, telling him everyone's probably okay. And there's a multitude of reasons that Todo's apprehensive here with this advice. Even though Todo swapped everyone out of the domain, Todo's plan was only built in the eventuality that everyone gets trapped in that domain, and not for the possibility that Sukuna would launch a small fucking nuke at them. We know this due to this conversation with Mei, where he only mentions Sukuna's domain. He doesn't mention this fire arrow after this. It's a bit of an oversight on Todo's part. And even in chapter 269, where everyone discusses the events, Todo again mentions how he was prepared for Sukuna's domain, and yet they couldn't save Choso. And Choso died via Sukuna's fire arrow. Now, despite everything that's happened, Todo couldn't quite fully convince Yuji in a way that he would have normally, but Yuji, choosing to believe what Choso has told him, steals himself, and the pair do this purely because right now, after Sukuna's domain, Sukuna is in a state in which it's painstakingly difficult to use his cursed technique, meaning right now, Todo and Yuji have the opportunity to lay the beating on Sukuna on their terms. Let's take the hoodie off. It's getting hot in here. Too many facts being dropped. Anyway, Yuji, Todo, and Sukuna begin fighting, with it being explained that Todo replaced the arm that Mahito destroyed with a Vibra Slap, a percussion instrument. If you're wondering what the Vibra Slap sounds like, it sounds like this. Imagine getting your ass whooped top to bottom, left, right, and center, and all you hear is this noise. It's kind of wild. Anyway, alongside having replaced his arm, Todo changed the activation conditions for his technique from a pause to the collision between the wooden box and the metal teeth of the Vibra Slap. Now, this allows him to activate his swapping technique roughly 50 times in a single second. Let me reiterate that for you. Roughly 50 times per second. That's a lot, by the way. Yuji, Sukuna, and Todo begin swapping at extreme speeds, and I want to point out to you that only Todo is smiling in this situation. Both Yuji and Sukuna lock in for a split second to try and adjust to this. The swapping stops as Yuji is now facing Sukuna with Todo at his back, as Sukuna charges his fist with kith energy and Yuji readies a strike. As the two prepared their strikes, Todo swaps them one more time, switching himself with Sukuna, allowing him to kick Sukuna in the chin and Yuji to land a clean blow onto Sukuna's stomach. Sukuna retreats to gain some distance between him, Yuji, and Todo, and he also notes that out of all of the sorcerers, none match Todo's egocentricity. He is surely the peskiest, and he appeared exactly when he least wanted him to. And Sukuna retreats into a ruined building with Todo and Yuji not far behind him. As Todo jumps from the ledge, he swaps himself with Sukuna as Todo tries to kick Sukuna, with Sukuna dodging by using the air as a surface once again. And Todo notes how Sukuna just leapt mid-air. With Todo looking very confused, we'll see Yuji preparing to toss a rock imbued with cursed energy. As he throws this rock, Todo swaps Yuji with the rock, and Yuji manages to land a clean dropkick onto Sukuna, with Yuji sliding across the floor on Sukuna using him as a skateboard. Sukuna grabs Yuji by the face and prepares to throw him, but Todo notices this and swaps Yuji's position with Sukuna, allowing for Yuji to land yet another clean blow on Sukuna, with Sukuna preparing to counter. However, Todo begins to swap the trio in a roulette fashion, again similar to earlier, with Sukuna thinking to himself, he can swap as much or as little as he liked, all with one tap. The fact that he can regulate it at will makes adapting to Boogie Woogie essentially impossible, and yet there is one single instance where I can definitively read his timing. While Sukuna is lost within this roulette of thought and swap, and Yuji lands another clean punch onto Sukuna here. Launching Sukuna through the ceiling and above ground, Sukuna notices how Yuji's focus is sharpening, and I suppose this goes back to Todo's planning of his fight with Sukuna and how Yuji could unknowingly let Sukuna in on these plans, because again, Sukuna would know the tells of Yuji sharpening his focus here, especially since he was present with both these team-ups with Todo, so he'll kind of know these tells in the same way that Yuji will have inadvertently learned cool techniques from Sukuna from witnessing that fight and being in his body. Sukuna is reminded of Yuji's fights against both Mahito and Hanami, in which both times a feint was employed by Todo in order to land a crucial blow. Now, as Yuji charges his fist with energy, so too does Sukuna, expecting a feint. However, Todo swaps one of Meimei's crows behind Sukuna, and Sukuna, thinking he misread Todo's plan, thinking that Yuji swapped with the crow, turns to eviscerate what he thinks is Yuji, but is actually Meimei's crow. Except, as the kick lands, Sukuna realizes it's not Yuji, and they are remained in the same position. Todo only brought in one of Meimei's crows from the outside, allowing Yuji to land a massive black flash on Sukuna. Yuji, now clawing at Sukuna's chest while holding onto Sukuna's lower right arm, looks up to see Sukuna preparing to cast Domain Expansion. Once again, we see a sizable claw mark on Sukuna's chest as he once again uses the same hand sign as Gojo. As the narrator kicks in, Sukuna's incredible efficiency meant that despite his cursed energy levels dropping to the levels of Yuta Rokotsu, if he were to recover his burnt out cursed technique, he'd be able to utilize Domain Expansion as many times as he needs. However, at that moment, what befell Sukuna was a vision of a man he buried with his own hands. The departed spirit of the strongest. This isn't really a detail, but I just want to point out and let you know how badly this one singular panel destroyed the community when it dropped that week. The theories and the ideas went absolutely crazy, along with the fans, especially with only one eye being shown. Gege absolutely knew what he was doing when he was playing with people when he dropped this panel. I refuse to believe otherwise. Yuji continues clawing at Sukuna's chest to the point where we actually see blood starting to spurt out of Sukuna's back here, and thoughts of Choso were heavy in his mind, but at this moment, none other than Yuta Rokotsu appears in the body of Gojo Satoru, using Gojo's body as a mech suit. The stitch marks on his forehead, Sukuna begins laughing in a manner I don't think we've ever actually seen him do throughout the entire series. He's like, this is a proper belly laugh, like a seriously maniacal laugh here. And somehow, Sukuna instantly knew it was Yuta who had taken over Gojo's body. In a way, I feel like in this moment, Sukuna related to Yuta in a little bit here, or vice versa, because in that moment, both of them have taken the same steps in order to come out ahead and secure a victory. In fact, I'd go so far as to say Yuta went one step further, because Suna's game plan throughout the series was to take Megumi's body, and this plan came into fruition as early as chapter 11, and Sukuna knew Megumi's body would be a good fit to take over, and his curse technique would be really good in a fight, especially since he planned to fight Gojo. After all, Sukuna did mention that once he made Yuji's body his own, Gojo would be the fittest person that he'd kill, except obviously he ended up in Megumi's body. But for Sukuna, Megumi was just another pawn, but for Yuta, Gojo was his sensei. He was the person who rescued him. Yuta took over Gojo's body out of love and selflessness, whereas Sukuna took over Megumi's body out of hatred and selfishness. We're given a flashback of Yuta talking to the rest of the gang about the possibility of him taking over Gojo should anything happen to him. And one thing I like is how this panel is framed. Not only is Yuta stood apart from the rest of the crowd here, but he's also in white while the others are all in black. It's also framed as if he's separate from them, alienated almost by how they treat Gojo and how he respects Gojo. But Panda goes on to mention how if Gojo dies, Rika can eat Kenjaku and copy his body hopping technique, which would let Yuta take over Gojo. Now we get a reveal to us in chapter 267 that Rika needs to ingest body parts to copy a technique, and the body part required depends on what he's trying to copy and how many times he can use it and how strong the technique actually is. You know, the stronger the technique, the more complicated the technique, the more lethal the body part required for Rika to ingest. And we also get a reveal that Yuta can't just copy physical traits, he can only copy techniques. Anyways, Maki mentions how Yuta can only use his copy technique when Rika is fully manifested, which only lasts 5 minutes, which is sort of an explanation as to why Rika was never manifested in the domain clash against Sukuna, or in the Yuta's domain against Sukuna here. Yuta admits he doesn't actually know what would happen if those 5 minutes run out and he's in Gojo's body, which is where Meimei chimes in with and suggests 3 possibilities. 1, Kenjaku's ability requires constant activation. In this case, the body and the soul won't be able to be maintained and he will die. 2, Kenjaku's ability is activated intermittently, meaning he won't die immediately, but it will just be a matter of time. 3, Kenjaku's technique needs only be activated once, even after the 5 minutes, and he'll be able to use the limitless technique permanently, basically. The side effect of this suggests the possibility of getting rid of Yuta's body as he just stays in Gojo's body forever. And there's a lot of points that I want to go over here, but I'll pin them just for a little moment, because Yuta mentions how he's not against that final option. Even if Rika isn't fully manifested, he's able to use copy inside of his domain, and he would like to try that first. If I fail here, then I will take Gojo's body. Maki, being very, very adamant against this plan, expresses his major dislikes over this, and Yuta tells everyone that he's getting annoyed. No matter how you look at it, it is what we should do. With Kusakabe mentioning how, sure, if we're only focused on the game plan here, we also have to worry about Yuta as a person, which is where Yuta really goes off. Questioning Kusakabe, Yuta exclaims, as a person, do you realize who we're up against? We are up against the strongest sorcerer in history, Sukuna Ryomen. If throwing away our humanity gives us a shot at winning, we should throw it away. Does becoming a monster really scare you that badly? And Maki tells Yuta that he's extremely important to everyone here, as well as to Maki. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But which is where Yuta blows up once more, asking them, what about Gojo? Is he not important to everyone else? We've always pushed the burden of being a monster onto him alone. And if he dies, one of us will have to take that spot. And if no one else will step up, then I will. Personally, this little storyline, I think, is one of Nage's best within the arc. To be honest with you, I really like how this is all executed. And way back when Kenjaku told Gojo that Yuta isn't anything special, and sorry to say, he cannot be the next Gojo Satoru, only for Yuta to literally become the next Gojo. Literally. Yuta mentions how they've always pushed the burden of being a monster onto him alone, and in chapter 236, Gojo mentions how he's no stranger to feeling isolated. There was always a gulf between Gojo and other people. Even if they adored him, you can admire a flower and help it bloom, but you can't ask it to understand you. In this moment, in 261, Yuta becomes one of the only people in the series outside of Sukuna to be able to understand just what it is to be Gojo Satoru. And even more fitting, given how Yuta truly is family to Gojo, with them sharing actual lineage. This flashback continues with Yuta, Maki, Ino, and Panda accompanying Gojo into Jujutsu HQ and the Elders room here. It's the same room that we saw Gojo in. Well, I'm assuming it's the same room that we saw Gojo in Jujutsu Kaisen 0, where we see brief visions of their faces, with Yuta asking for Gojo's permission to take over his body should he lose, with Gojo mentioning, you seem really pissed, but I'm not going to lose here. But I'm going to assume that this was right after Yuta's rant and conversation with everyone, hence his frustration. But Gojo says, you know, I'm not going to lose, so I don't really care what you do with my body, but Shoko not caring is kind of pissing me off. Yuta and Gojo discuss their heritage, with Yuta being confused about what Uro mentioned to him about how he was a Fujiwara instead of a Sugawara, which Gege never directly answers, with Gojo saying perhaps that they're both right here. Maybe Yuta was also born of Fujiwara and Sugawara descent. To which Gojo notes, then if that's the case, Yuta will have been born more blessed than Gojo himself. Then going on to tease Yuta about taking care of his sloppy cursed energy control, a problem that Yuta has dealt with since Jujutsu Kaisen 0, as he shattered his own sword against Geto, overcharging it with cursed energy. And I like Gojo standing here with his original students, the first students we're introduced to in Jujutsu Kaisen 0, which technically in chronological order makes them the first students of Gojo, I suppose. But Gojo goes into the room in order to kill the elders of the Jujutsu HQ, meaning how once this is done, Gakuganji will be in charge, which is interesting considering how they were odds at the beginning of the series here. But at least even if they were at odds, Gojo trusts him to take over the world that comes after when he goes. If I had to take a guess in the timeline, this event is more than likely happened just before Gojo left to go and fight Sukuna, as we see pretty much the ending of this flashback just before he goes to fight Sukuna. Now, before Gojo closes the door, Yuta pleads with him once more to not bear the burden of being a monster alone anymore. And Gojo talks about, there is nothing that can be done about that. Back then, I was left in the dust, and I have to catch up, as Gojo remembers Geto and how Geto left him way back when. And I'll be honest with you, I'd love to go through Gojo and Suguru's dynamic in a whole separate video, because that's just another kind of worms that I would love to dive into. So if you want to see that, comment down below. Also, we're shown finally what Amai's powers can do, and he's simply able to apply the sugar in his blood and manifest it. And Amai actually helped save Angel by creating jelly and cushioning her fall. Also, Takaba apparently helped just by being there. It's never really specified what, but I'm going to assume that he probably nullified damage maybe or something, nullified the pain, I don't know. But Shoko asks if he can transfer that sugar to others, with Amai agreeing that he can absolutely do that, and Amai ends up joining the medical team to help with the brain of Yuta during his technique activation. And we cut to the operating room, where we see Yuta, who is split in two from Sukuna, and just off to the side here we see Gojo. We also see Nita, who's present at Yuta's side, and if you don't remember Nita, this was the same person who helped Nobara back in Shibuya with hair wounds, employing explain the same technique to Yuta after his injury, ensuring his wounds don't get any worse, but, you know, he can't really be healed at the moment. But Nita notes that Yuta can't heal himself here. He got split in two in the exact same way that Gojo did, and this is beyond Yuta's reverse case technique, let alone Nita's ability. Something I've always liked about Jujutsu Kaisen here is that RCT, while it is powerful, it has its limits. You can't just regrow a set of legs, an arm, yes, an eye, yes. Healing the brain, sure, but like certain just damage, apparently if you just get cut off from the stomach below, you can't just regrow a set of legs like Deadpool. But Yuta tells Shoko that he's maintaining consciousness thanks to Rika, but he's reaching his limit, and mentions how he's going to do it. He's going to transfer to Gojo, and Shoko mentions how she's finished suturing Gojo's body, so once Yuta has swapped, he'll need to use RCT full throttle in order to finish the treatment, mentioning how Amai will help. As mentioned before, Amai will use the sugar to supplement the brain as it's being swapped. Before swapping, Yuta actually apologizes, saying, "Sorry that I had to move you to my right." This is an apology for Rika, who is normally summoned by the ring on the left hand of Yuta. We see this ring on the left hand many times throughout the series, but due to that ring having been sort of like cut off by Sukuna here, he had to move it over. We cut back to the present and we see Yuta and Sukuna both using the same hand signs to activate their domains, once again hammering home that Sukuna's pretty much, he's copying Gojo here, he's stealing that man's flow. And as the two domains clash, we see Yuta's Unlimited Void clashing with Malevolent Shrine, and Sukuna's Shrine is completely different from his usual appearance since he began using Gojo's hand sign. With both Yuta and Sukuna activating their domains, they both employ the same tactics used by Gojo and Sukuna in their fight. Yuta making the domain barrier smaller in order to counter Sukuna's open barrier domain with his sure hit targets in the outer of the barrier. But as I pointed out in the Gojo vs Sukuna video, by the way, go and watch that if you haven't already, when this happens, we see the sure hit of Sukuna's domain attacking the outside of Yuta's domain. We can tell by the ground underneath Yuta's barrier being shredded to bits, and that's due to Malevolent Shrine. Now the narrator goes on to explain how the countermeasure Gojo worked out against Sukuna's domain was a shrunken barrier. As I mentioned in the Gojo vs Sukuna video, I like to call this domain compression as opposed to domain expansion, but once again, for approximately 3 minutes it is possible to withstand the effects of Malevolent Shrine beating down on the barrier from the outside. As I mentioned earlier, we see Sukuna's domain ripping apart the floor underneath Yuta's barrier, and on top of this 3 minutes was something that was actually worked out by the Jujutsu students during the Gojo and Sukuna fight. In chapter 228, Mei noted how it took 3 minutes and 9 seconds until their domains collapsed, and this was around the time that Gojo took to inflict enough damage on Sukuna in order to collapse his domain, and enough time for Sukuna to also collapse Gojo's domain from the outside. Now, Yuta notes how during his switch training with Gojo, it allowed him to elevate his barrier techniques too, which was evident based on Yuta's original domain against Sukuna, because during that domain, Yuta did things there that are considered pretty impressive feats. One, he made sure that everyone inside of the domain, in his domain, himself, Rika, and Yuji only were not being targeted by the sure hit, and it was only targeting Sukuna, something that even Sukuna noted that this type of thing requires a very sophisticated barrier technique to achieve. Two, Yuta also was able to move his domain coordinates from where it was originally planted to a place where the team could ambush him. Yuta notes that taking into account Sukuna's fatigue, he should be able to stall the domain for 3 minutes like Gojo did. However, Sukuna, on the other hand, now doesn't have to adhere to the previously self-imposed 99-second time limit on his domain, as I explained earlier, because with this domain, Sukuna is now restricting Malevolent Shrine's effective range to the outline of Yuta's domain, as I mentioned earlier. 3 minutes, one professional boxing round. Within these 3 minutes, Yuta believes he will damage Sukuna to the point that he cannot use Malevolent Shrine, a similar goal to Gojo in chapter 229, and in these same 3 minutes, Sukuna believes he will destroy Unlimited Void and expand his effective range in an effort to slaughter everyone outside of it. Now, it is also worth noting how horrific Sukuna's new domain looks just in this specific panel. As I mentioned before, it's like a fusion of Megami Shikigami and Sukuna's Shrine. In the original release here, this is absolutely scuffed. The artwork was not finished. This is one of those chapters where Gege fell ill, so this artwork wasn't finished, but in the official volume it just looks like shadows, which is kind of reminiscent of the 10 shadows technique almost when you compare them side by side to Megami's domain and Sukuna's domain. Very similar. Now, I mentioned how in Gojo vs Sukuna in that video, throughout the whole fight, Gojo's usage of blue was insanely troubling for Sukuna. Those two combinations were just really difficult for Sukuna to deal with, and Gojo managed to use blue to an incredible effect to mess up Sukuna at any given point where possible. Now, Yuta tries this same thing, but due to Sukuna being Sukuna, he's already familiar with the game plan here, because we see Yuta using a ball of blue to pull Sukuna in, but now Sukuna uses this attraction to his advantage, getting close into Yuta's face and countering Yuta's opening punch with his own 1-2 punch combo. This little tactic that Sukuna did is almost bar for bar the exact same thing that Gojo did to Maharaga when Gojo used the blue's speed to his own advantage. Maharaga was not able to catch the ball of red, and Gojo used their own blue to his advantage. This is pretty much the exact same thing. Sukuna is using Yuta's blue to his own advantage and has prepared for the speed boost because obviously he's experienced it so many times now. Something very sneaky also happens at this point because Yuta is struck by Sukuna, and to Yuta's surprise, he is shocked by how Sukuna was able to bypass Infinity with domain amplification while also using domain expansion. And this is the same thing that also surprised Gojo in chapter 227. Again, as I mentioned in my Gojo video, go and watch that. That is also another video that took a lot of time to put together. It's another half hour worth of content for you. However, despite being in Gojo's body, there was a few reasons that he didn't know Sukuna could do this. One, when these domains clashed originally, the crows that had been spectating the fight couldn't enter the domain. They couldn't even get close for that instance due to Sukuna's sure hit attacking the outside of the domain. Two, Yuta didn't have the time to go through Gojo's memories to reach this information. And there's a few differences to how people inherit memories in bodies based on how they've got hold of that body. For example, if you are a vessel, for example, Sukuna and Yuji, Sukuna had access to Yuji's memories as if it was a cinema, essentially. We get this confirmed in chapter 212 from Megami when he watches Sumiki's body turn out to be Yorozu, stating the following: an incarnated sorcerer receives information about the modern era from the vessel's brain, and that's why Choso, Sukuna, and the incarnated players are able to function in the modern era. If so, reading the vessel's memories and impersonating the vessel should be entirely possible. But Kenjaku's technique of body swapping is entirely different because an incarnated player basically hijacks the vessel's brain. Kenjaku's takes the original brain and replaces it with his own. And in this instance, Kenjaku in chapter 91 mentions how bodies' memories can be retained and they don't just flow into the body the same way they do as a vessel and an incarnated player. Yuta mentions how he's being thorough going through Gojo's memories one by one. We get a visual representation of this during the fight as Yuta recalls Gojo at different periods in his life. And to top all of this off, Yuta was also in the process of trying to figure out an entirely new technique, and that's talked about in chapter 269, where Kusagabe mentions the difference between someone having a technique for a millennia would be more prepared than someone having a fresh copy who's literally just got a hold of it. Even mentioning how Kenjaku likely separated the techniques using barrier techniques, which is something that Kenjaku showed a lot of experience with during his fight with Tengen and Yuki. And Tengen even noted that Kenjaku was able to configure the Sunyata barrier, which Tengen made. He was able to do that and make it into a theater as he pleases. And Tengen even tells Yuki how Kenjaku is one of the exceedingly few users of barriers who can match him on barrier techniques. And also, Kenjaku's the only other person in the entire series with an open domain outside of Sukuna, which is kind of impressive. So with all of this in mind, Yuta went into this fight with all the tools to win, but not the experience in order to do so. Kind of like putting a regular driver into an F1 car. Sure, they're in an F1 car now, they can go fast, but they don't have the experience to drive it. So we see Rika crying and holding Yuta's original body, and it's revealed later on down the line that Rika actually kept this body alive with RCT, possibly in a similar way to how Sukuna kept himself alive without a heart early on in the series, and how he kept his heart beating, basically. We see Yuta and Sukuna continuing their fight, with Yuta throwing Sukuna over his shoulder and proceeding to kick Sukuna in the face, and Sukuna manages to block this at the very, very last moment here, but we get a moment with Yuta noting how Rika isn't haunting this body anymore. This was made apparent by both of these panels, with Rika literally hugging and cradling Yuta's body, but Yuta now notes how he can only use Limitless, and this is a side effect of Kenjaku's technique, which sounds confusing because Yuta mentions how it looks like using Kenjaku's technique simultaneously is a no-go, but what he means by this is when he fully manifests Rika, he's able to use his copy technique. This in turn allows Yuta to access the copied version of Kenjaku's body swap technique, and this resulted in Yuta being placed into Gojo's body. So right now, Yuta has two techniques activated simultaneously, technically, or not really. So right now, he activated copy, then he activated Kenjaku's, which seems to be a one-time activation, but now, because of that, he is now able to use the Limitless technique as a side effect. But that means Yuta can't use his other stored techniques due to Rika not coming with him from his body to Gojo's. Yuta continues thinking to himself how with Sukuna's left arms gone, he cannot use the whale slash, and aside from domain amplification, Sukuna shouldn't have any tricks left to bypass infinity. Right after this, Yuta slaps Sukuna. And he does this by complete accident, by the way, to which Sukuna notices and seems outright shocked. Narrowly dodging Sukuna's counter, Yuta remembers how he had this exact same problem and thought during his switch training with Gojo. Gojo's limbs are just absurdly wrong. There's Gojo fangirls and fanboys collectively just moaned at that sentence, and if you're one of them, get out my comments. I'm just kidding. Just don't make a mess in my comments. Anyway, Yuta catches a kick from Sukuna and steps back to create space. While doing so, Yuta notes just how difficult the limitless technique is to use. As I mentioned before, it's kind of like just putting a regular person in an F1 car. It just doesn't work. From the outside looking in, the limitless seems flawless and all-powerful, and yet it's way more sensitive than I thought. A single round of switch training is nowhere near enough to master it. And this little thought calls into question Gojo's hard work, and it goes unseen throughout the entire series, because people within the world of Jujutsu Kaisen, people in the real world, fans of the series, often just hear about Gojo and think he was just born this way. But realistically, it took Gojo 17 years, him dying, plus a year or more of intensive training in order to get to the point that he was at. Which makes me wonder about a question that I have rattling around in my brain, and I want to ask you all in the comments. Do you think Gojo is the strongest he could have possibly been at this point when he dies? Or do you think he could have gotten way stronger? Do you think he could have gotten way, way higher? But Yuta tries to use blue and it misfires. Almost a direct reference to Gojo's red that misfired in the hidden inventory arc. With Yuta saying, I finally get why you need the 6 eyes to use this thing. Anyone can sit in a Formula 1 car, but not everyone can drive it, as I keep saying. Anyways, Yuta flashes back to Gojo confidently saying, I'm the strongest after all. To which Yuta questions, just what did it take for you to say that so confidently? And the real answer is everything. It took Gojo literally everything to get to where he was. He lost his best friend. He died during it. It's insane of what Gojo did to get to this point. But Sukuna closes the distance, thinking to himself, he looks like he has no clue how to handle such a troublesome technique, asking Yuta, do you really think you have time to daydream? Remember, as all of this is happening, Yuta is still trying to go through Gojo's memories, learn a new technique and its intricacies, as well as on the fly fighting Sukuna. So he's getting put in the blender right now. But the punch lands on Yuta, sending him flying back, with Sukuna remembering that Kenjaku told him that Yuta's technique was copy. Copying a technique likely requires feeding the target's body, or a part of it, to that Banshee. How does Sukuna know this? Well, Yuta's first fight against Sukuna, where they activated the domain, Yuta reveals to Sukuna that he never retrieved that last finger of his. Remember I was talking about Yuta's bluffs and his shenanigans earlier on, and Sukuna pieces it together that Yuta and Rika had to have eaten the finger here in order to gain his powers. And now Sukuna questions a lot of the circumstances happening right now. Where is Rika? Why did she not come with the body swap? Can he even use his other copied abilities? But even if he can, Sukuna already has a good idea of what he has in his arsenal, and right now Limitless is nothing more than a side effect of Kenjaku's technique, and Sukuna confirmed in Yuta's original domain that he's unable to use techniques simultaneously, and right now Yuta has no other cards besides Limitless, which is where the realization dawns on Sukuna. What if Yuta came into this fight assuming there would be no coming back, which is pretty much exactly right. Yuta went into this fight assuming that he could die doing this, which means Yuta's next move would be the Hollow Purple that Gojo used against Sukuna. And we once again flash back to Yuta being told by Gojo that his cursed energy is all over the place. Now, this is something that keeps coming up, and this is my own personal theory and a little bit of a headcanon, but I think one of the reasons that Yuta is remembering Gojo scolding him like this is because of Yuta's nervous nature. It's like when someone tells you not to worry about something, but you do. He had these same sort of thoughts and what-ifs and doubts just before he fought Sukuna. And obviously, if you know Yuta and you've read the story, you know that dude's just a worry-wart. He just worries all the time. But this flashback also happens at some point between JJK 0 and Shibuya. How do we know? Maki still wears her glasses, has long hair, plus she has no scars. So it's possible that this could be on the way or just after the previously referenced Goodwill games in which Yuta actually beat the entirety of the Kyoto school single-handedly. Yuta mentions how he's going through Gojo's memories one by one. He's being thorough with this, which is where he begins the chance for Hollow Purple. However, Sukuna is not trying to go 3 for 3 on Hollow Purples here, blocking the hand signs and punching Yuta in the face and launching him into a pile of skulls. Sukuna proceeds to note how Yuta mustn't understand why Gojo needed to fire a purple in such a roundabout way when they fought, noting how he will not give Yuta a single opening to use that move. Now, Yuta notes how Sukuna might still be wary of him using multiple techniques outside of Limitless, but he should already know that he can't, and that's why this simple plan will work. Just thought, by the way, that kind of sounds like a YouTube video. That's why this simple plan will work. Anyway, using blue, Yuta pulls in a tape recorder with Inomaki's voice on it that lets Sukuna get hit by the don't move. Now, as this is activated, we're given a panel of Inomaki coughing up an extreme amount of blood, and this is because of the reverb from using the cursed speech on someone like Sukuna. As noted Quoted by Panda, Inumaki's cursed speech only worked due to the timing which made the reaction survivable. If we'd have used that tape recorder earlier on when Sukuna was healthy, Inumaki would have been killed by the feedback. This gets noted in chapter 269. However, this also isn't the first time that we've seen cursed speech work through technology. In the Goodwill games, Inumaki actually puts Miwa to sleep through a phone and even tells Megami Shikigami to return just after this, which is quite cool. Yuta prepares to fire off the Hollow Purple on Sukuna, and as he fires that Hollow Purple, this Hollow Purple actually ends up blasting through Yuta's domain, and Sukuna comes barreling out of the smoke cloud created by this explosion. Shocked that Yuta actually pulled it off, and as powerful as Purple may be, Yuta is still not comfortable using it. As I mentioned before, Gojo is constantly on Yuta's ass about his sloppy cursed energy control, and this is something that continually haunts Yuta throughout the series. In JJK 0, as I mentioned before, he ends up breaking a sword against Geto, and then we have this flashback with Gojo getting on his ass about this again, and then in chapter 140, when Yuji fights against Yuta, he has a flashback to Todo explaining how an elite level fighter is hard to read by just cursed energy due to their control over it, but Yuta is constantly surging with it, hinting once again at his lack of control over the CE, which kind of works in his preference, but also not at the same time. Now, regardless, we see Sukuna having sustained heavy damage from this purple, and thus having lost his domain, along with Yuta breaking his own barrier, which is where Yuji, Yuta, and Todo charge towards Sukuna, but Gege subtly hints that something's going wrong here, because Yuta, as he's coming out of the smoke, his eyes are covered, and this is like a common trope in anime and manga to indicate that something is just wrong, something's about to happen here, something's bad. And lo and behold, it does happen. Due to Sukuna having used his domain, he is once again in a spot where it is hard for him to use his cursed technique. But Yuta, on the other hand, Kenjaku's technique, copied by Yuta, had burned out after using his domain expansion before the 5-minute limit of Rika had expired. And because of this, the use of Kenjaku's technique had halted, basically telling us Yuta is now just a brain in a jar, or a brain in a mech suit, a brain in a Gojo, I guess. Without Rika present to help reactivate copy, and thus allowing him to use body swap again, Yuta's just a sitting duck now. And Yuta, rightfully frustrated by this turn of events, notes how because Rika never came with him to this body, copy is no longer his, and the burnt out technique is limitless, and he can't reactivate the body swap because he doesn't have copy. He talks about how there must have been some trick that Kenjaku was able to use after following a domain, mentioned how he didn't take in any information like that when he copied the technique. I mentioned earlier how Kusakabe mentioned that Kenjaku might have used a barrier technique in order to separate the techniques. Now, while I dived into things that Tengen had mentioned about Kenjaku's skill as a barrier user, I waited till now to mention how he actually got a glimpse of Kenjaku's skill with barriers in the aftermath of Yuki's black hole, because in chapter 208, Kenjaku mentions how he used his own body as a domain to raise the technique lapse limit on the activation time and the unsteady output. Ignoring the rest of that gobbledygook that fucking Kenjaku just said, he's admitting that he can use his own body as a domain, which is kind of fucking nuts, so it makes you wonder what else he can do. Anyways, we get back into the fight, and Todo is distracted by the downfall of Yuta, and he even notes how Sukuna's not going to let that open and slide, and Sukuna connects with a black flash. As he does, Todo's Vibra Slap is broken by the impact. Yuji approaches Sukuna from behind, ready to strike, only for Sukuna to turn in an effort to counter. Todo, using the remainder of his Vibra Slap, swaps Yuji and Sukuna, allowing for Yuji to land a clean blow on Sukuna's face. However, what happens here is Yuji is actually swapped with a shard of Yuta's domain, a domain that Yuta had shattered, but decided to maintain the barrier for Yuji and Todo's sake. How does he do this? I'm not even remotely sure, I'll be honest with you, and I wonder if it's just him pouring his cursed energy into the shards in order to help Yuji and Todo. I don't know how that works, to be honest with you, but apparently it happens. As Todo explains, there is no greater stage for Boogie Woogie to shine upon, because remember, Boogie Woogie can target objects and anything with cursed energy over a certain level. Todo begins swapping Yuji like a roulette around Sukuna, and Todo does this by placing the remaining Vibra Slap part into his mouth and begins shaking it, I think, like a dog with a toy. I don't know how he's doing this. However, this enables Yuji to make contact with Sukuna and land the second dismantle onto Sukuna within this fight. The first one landed was just after he had awakened the technique, and Sukuna notes that Yuji is selectively choosing the target of his technique. Yuji was firing dismantle after dismantle directly at the barrier between Sukuna and Megami's soul. And for the first time in the series, Yuji does two things. One, he makes a binding vow in a way that improves his attack. Huge. Finally, our protagonists are using binding vows. Two, He makes Sukuna think about losing. This is the first time in the entire series that Sukuna even entertains the concept of losing a fight. Due to Yuji's soul dismantles here, we see Sukuna vomiting 3 fingers before scoffing them both back down. Sukuna jumps away to create space between him and Yuji, jumping onto a beam above them, and Yuji, using a common strategy by Sukuna, uses his dismantle to destroy Sukuna's footing. However, Sukuna uses the air stepping technique once again, and we see it highlighted in this panel right here, and then in this panel showing Sukuna bouncing from mid-air to the wall to behind Yuji. Landing a punch on Yuji, sending him into the wall, we see Sukuna thinking to himself, if I just avoid Yuji's touch, they have no other moves to affect me. This little sequence of events was just truly beautiful to unfold, and it may not look like it, but I want to give you all of the details here because this is just truly beautiful. Sukuna, Yuji, and Todo now stare each other down. Shards of Yuta's domain are still falling from the sky, and Todo mentions how if his spare Vibra Slap isn't recognized as his left hand, it will not function, asking for just one more time. Todo uses his Boogie Woogie one more time with Sukuna, and Yuji stood still. Sukuna thinks to himself, there was no swap. However, there was a swap. The swap was just for someone else. Todo swaps one of the shards for Angel, and through the use of a Bind and Vow, the range of Todo's technique had been extended, allowing him to swap Angel from a position far away to where they are now. Now we get into a flashback to the remainder of the conversation that happens between Yuta and Angel in chapter 220, in which Yuta asks if Angel can swap hosts like Sukuna, with Angel saying no. Yuta tells Angel he would like for her to stay under the battle, but fire Jacob's ladder from afar to land the finishing blow, and Yuta explains a strong point of his case technique. When dealing with this technique, no one thinks of the original user of the copy technique. For whatever reason, all they think about is how many techniques I have in my stock, and they don't stop to think about the possibility of the original user appearing. Yuta literally had just hit Sukuna with this exact same strategy in his domain, using Inumaki's case speech to stop Sukuna in his tracks. But on top of this, Todo hits Sukuna with almost the exact same tactic again. Instead of swapping, Todo brings in an external factor. Last time it was Mimi's Crow, this time it was Angel, but this time Angel is pulling up with Jacob's ladder on Sukuna. Now some details here, this Jacob ladder has these little angels with skulls in it, which kind of remind me of the Servo babies from Warhammer, which these guys, they were in Yuta's, but they didn't get added to the first Jacob's ladder in chapter 214 until after the official volume had released. But on top of this, you can tell Angel has recuperated from her injuries inflicted on her by Sukuna, or at least semi-recuperated, because the last time we saw her, her wings had shrunken significantly, but now, however, she is still missing an arm, and her wings have grown back to normal. The missing an arm part is also very important. The Jacob's ladder lands, however, Sukuna punching the ground and begins throwing the rocks up the Jacob's ladder, and we see Sukuna's fist connecting with the ground and his hand preparing to throw the rock. Sukuna begins ascending the ladder using these rocks, much to Angel's terror. I mean, I just know at this point this woman would be shitting her pants seeing this thing coming at her right now. I'll be honest with you, because I would be the same. Sukuna notes that unlike in Yuta's domain, where he could select the target for the sure hit, this one will hit Yuji and Todo. If Sukuna can scale the ladder, he can reach Angel without any interference. And what I love about this is seeing how unfazed Yuji was by his slashes earlier from his original slashes when they fought in 215. Sukuna assumed that Yuji wouldn't follow him into this attack, and I find that very interesting. A hard miscalculation on Sukuna's part, but we see Angel telling Hana to fall back. As Hana retreats out of the ladder, Sukuna follows closely, and Sukuna notes that they are coexisting in that body. They're nothing but a strong technique in a weak body. Losing one of their arms makes that fact all the more true, but they aren't able to gather the same output as they did back then. Now, my theory here is that losing a limb can decrease the output of a sorcerer's cursed technique, or at least the control of their cursed energy sort of weakens. We see something similar with Gojo. Once Gojo loses his arm, he doesn't just use a regular blue, he opts to use a maximum output blue, which could be a hint to this, or it could be the fact that Jacob's ladder actually requires both hands to be placed on the trumpet in order to gain its full power. But Sukuna notes that before he's torn from Megami's body, he will snuff out her life. However, Todo, leaping from the building below in front of Sukuna's Black Flash, he eats that motherfucker, making that the second Black Flash that he has ate from Sukuna, with Sukuna now noting how Todo is truly a Jujutsu sorcerer to his very, very core. Todo and Angel get sent crashing down through 2 buildings as a result of this Black Flash, and Sukuna notes how now Angel and both Todo are now out of commission. It's only Yuji left. Turning around to see Yuji emerging from the Jacob's ladder, again, it shocks me that Sukuna, of all people is in shock that Yuji put himself in harm's way to do damage on his opponent. Because remember, if it is only pain, Yuji Itadori will not stop. Landing a clean hit on Sukuna and then proceeding to grab Sukuna's ankles and powerbomb him through a building, sliding out from the rubble that was just created by Yuji's attack, only to realize Yuji was already behind him. We see Sukuna shocked to this as Yuji once again pulling a trick from Sukuna and dismantling Sukuna's footing, except as Sukuna dodges, he lands on one hand, but at this moment, Sukuna's RCT finally comes back, and we see Sukuna's hand being highlighted, and this is actually his left hand throwing multiple punches at Yuji as we see 3 strikes representing each of Sukuna's arms, and the 4th lands, knocking Yuji away. Sukuna had finally regained his RCT as a result of the Black Flash landed on Todo, and Sukuna notes how there is no need for him to make a risky move like Gojo, and this is in reference to Gojo healing his burnt out Curse technique that resulted in Gojo's brain being fried. Now I want to put a pin in this for now because it'll be an important detail a little bit later on, but Yuji throws a punch at Sukuna that is caught and yanked outwards as Sukuna throws a lower left that Yuji catches. However, a simple arm differential here allows Sukuna to land a double overhand right on Yuji. On landing to the body and one to the head, as Yuji is pushed down, Sukuna knees him hard in the head, causing Yuji to stumble away. Going back to what Sukuna mentioned in the previous thing about not taking risks, he expands on this here, mentioning how he just needs to wait for his technique to recover because Yuji has no threat to his life. And Yuji once again takes Sukuna a footing away from him, but rather than breaking the whole building this time, he takes away only a few bricks. And Sukuna's caught off guard by this. 3rd time's a charm, I guess. But Yuji once again tries to dismantle on Sukuna, but misses and lands on the generator behind Sukuna instead. Now Sukuna notes how Yuji's technique is lethal to an incarnated type like him, but it's useless if it doesn't land. Punching Yuji in the face to knock him away to put space between them. As this happens, Yuji Itadori does the unthinkable. Recalling his time with Gojo inside Jogo's domain, Yuji remembers how a domain will give the sorcerer a buff, and on top of all of this, techniques imbued are guaranteed to hit. And with this, we see Yuji finally unleashing his domain expansion. A domain expansion with a hand sign that is almost the direct opposite of Sukuna's. Yuji's hand sign is one that represents guiding others to enlightenment before himself, and this will become important a little bit later on, so again, I want to put another pin in this. But this moment for Yuji was absolutely perfectly timed. Even though Sukuna had just gained RCT, he still doesn't have his technique, and also his output and control over Megumi's body will still be incredibly weak due to the many blows Yuji had already landed, plus the flurry of Black Flashes earlier. So Sukuna had no way to counter this domain from Yuji except for Hollow Wicker Basket. Sukuna comes to in a train station and he is utterly confused by these events. He is dumbfounded that Yuji was able to do this, and Sukuna is also back in a more familiar form in the form of Yuji Kuna here in his original Yuji Sukuna form. Now chapter 265 is what I believe to be JJK's penultimate chapter in Jujutsu Kaisen as far as I'm concerned. On the surface, the chapter comes across as just a bit of a yap fest, sort of like this video, of a chapter where you dig into it a little bit deeper, as is the case with a lot of Jujutsu Kaisen. You find a lot to feast on. First things first, Yuji's domain. Yuji's domain is activated, but it's never actually given a name, and it's never stated in the manga, but there's a lot of context clues that lead you to the answer. Throughout Yuji's entire story within this story, there is a common theme: selflessness. The entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen revolves around Yuji choosing to take action in order to save someone, foregoing any consequences of what might actually happen to him. He's ready to forego his life. From chapter 1, Yuji resigns himself to death and takes comfort in the fact that his death will do good for the world. He's selfless every single time. Now this leads into Yuji's domain hand sign, a hand sign that represents the enlightenment of others before himself. Now I believe this is why when Yuji activates his domain, there is never a name given. Not because JJK was lazy or he didn't care. If this video has done anything, it should have proved to you that JJK's attention to detail and the love he put into the story was very, very evident. But Yuji's domain not having a name is something that fits Yuji personally, because him taking action and foregoing the consequences, hell, in the very next chapter, he literally says to Sukuna, I did this a little frantically, so I don't really get it either. Now, Sukuna also notes how he's experienced this kind of thing before, a rare phenomena of connecting with a sorcerer during the height of battle. Now, I thought this was a side effect due to some sort of energy being born of humans, which is interesting because what Sukuna is actually referring to here is the interaction with Jogo in Shibuya and his interaction with Kashimo, but Yuji's domain serves to recreate his hometown perfectly, as him and Sukuna walk through the town town as Yuji recounts pivotal moments in his life, where he recounts how he had moved from this place to Sendai, where he was born but was raised in this town. But he comes back after 10 years or so and he saw how the town had become somewhat of a ghost town, and Yuji notes how it didn't surprise him and he kind of expected it to happen. Now this was in reference to Yuji noting the passage of time and how things change over time, and this becomes a common theme throughout the chapter as Yuji and Sukuna walk together. Yuji takes Sukuna to a park where he'd used to play when he was a kid, and once again noting the changing of times, noting how there's no play equipment left anymore, and the symbolism of Sukuna being inside a cage here is also sort of intentional. It's as if Gege is telling us Sukuna can't really go anywhere. He's forced to listen to Yuji. He's got to be a part of this yap fest. Now Yuji notices some flowers and refers to them as morning glory. That Sukuna corrects him and calls them a hydrangea. I cannot pronounce that word. Given up on that one. But once again, Yuji goes on to talk about the passage of time, noting how he only noticed these flowers once he'd moved away. He's taken notice in beauty. It's almost as if to say you can't notice the forest for the trees when you're surrounded by it. On a personal note, this section kind of reminded me of what Takuan told Musashi during their walk. Preoccupied by a single leaf, you will miss the tree, and preoccupied by a single tree, you'll miss the forest. Yuji asks Sukuna if he's into flowers, but Sukuna reminds him that he'd gotten that information from Megami's memories, so Megami's into flowers, I guess. But the two continue further with Yuji and Sukuna stopping to catch crayfish, with Yuji teasing Sukuna, asking him unless, the strongest sorcerer in history can't catch some crayfish. Now Sukuna snatches the fishing rod and the two catch some crayfish, with Sukuna making a jab at Yuji's calling it microscopic. Looks pretty big to me, but whatever. Anyway, Yuji tells him that he got an American crayfish, but Yuji caught a Japanese one, and that's way more rare. Sukuna's crayfish stands up tall and almost looks like he's imitating Sukuna with these forearm poses here, but Yuji's is more quiet and subdued. But due to it being rare, it draws comparison to how rare Yuji's existence is, because again, remember, it's like a 1 in 1 million chance that this existence can happen, essentially. Again, the two continue further in with Yuji noting how this department store opened when he was 5, but as time went on, more and more small businesses closed due to the bigger store appearing. Now, there's a running theme of time passing, as I've mentioned, and things changing due to that time passing, like the grasshoppers and the rice, noting how he's not seen many of them anymore. And Yuji notes how his grandpa had taken him to this farm many, many times, and now he thinks about how much of his parenting that he did in his mom and dad's place from his granddad. Now, what I find interesting here is in this very moment, Sukuna didn't really tell Yuji about Kenjaku, which also at the same time is very, very par for the course for Sukuna. I mean, the dude wants nothing to do with Yuji, so why the fuck would he tell Yuji that Kenjaku is his father? But the two eventually arrive at an archery place here where they compete, with Sukuna only hitting bullseyes, and Yuji remarks about how he doesn't really want to play with Sukuna anymore. When Sukuna remarks like, how is it, it's obvious that I would be more accustomed to this. And this is obviously a direct reference to not only the time period that Sukuna is from, but also to Sukuna's fairness attack. The two continue even further with it starting to snow. Now, this wasn't mentioned until the epilogue in volume 30, but Yuji mentions to Ozawa in the epilogue how, unlike fireworks in the sea that becomes less and less special, the snow has a special feeling. The snow is a common theme for Yuji. It appears when he defeated Mahito, and once again during his fight with Sukuna. It appears at pivotal moments in his life. It also appears when he's like speaking to Ozawa, which I think is quite nice. And we get this little panel of Yuji's grandpa looking at Yuji in disgust with Yuji drinking hot chocolate, which again I also found funny considering Yuji's grandpa is the reincarnation of Sukuna's twin. It just feels like both of those two, Sukuna would also look at Yuji in disgust, and so is Sukuna's twin apparently. But Sukuna eventually tells Yuji he's had enough of this. He tells him to say what it is that he wants to say. Now we see multiple dragonflies surrounding Yuji at this point, and now according to Google, dragonflies around the world symbolize change in perspective and self-realization, the kind that takes someone to understand the deeper meaning of life. Now remember, Yuji's hand sign is for leading people to enlightenment before himself. These dragonflies symbolize a lot of mentality and a change that is happening within Yuji, as mentioned during and just after Sukuna's fairness attack. But Yuji mentions how up until recently he thought that he should simply live to fulfill his role as he understood it. Yuji's role as he understood it was to be a cog. It was to exercise curses and then die and take Sukuna with him. That was his role as far as he was concerned. And Yuji thought that if he died like that, he could consider it proper death. But now he doesn't feel like that's right. As this is happening, we are showing people who have had a pivotal role in Yuji's life. His grandpa, Junpei, Nanami, Nobara, Choso, Gojo, Mahito, and even Sukuna. Pretty much all of the people Yuji thinks about here are people who have died at some point or people believes to be dead. Cough, cough, Nobara. All with the exception of Sukuna. But Yuji continues by saying, walking the dog, raising a family, any sort of thing like that is fine. Even if you don't have anything like that, as long as you can eat, shit, and sleep. Even if you're stuck in bed, sick, even if you've spent your life with no connections and nothing remains of you, more than the memories made in one's image, It's with the little tiny fragments that remain drifting off where the value of a life lies. It never had anything to do with the ways people die. As Yuji says this, we are shown Mahito, and this is almost like a direct callback to his conversation with Yuji and Nanami upon finding Mahito's victims, where Nanami notes how upset Yuji is and how he genuinely gets upset about people's deaths. Yuji mentions how he could never forgive those that act as if that value didn't exist. A callback to Yuji's fights with Mahito, where that clash of ideals and how Mahito treated the deaths of Yuji's comrades comes to fruition. All of this conversation culminates in Yuji telling Sukuna he loathes him, and that the humans aren't tools, we aren't born with any set role. But interestingly, as he says this, we're shown a pair of scissors, which is something that appears whenever Yuji uses his technique, so I wonder if there's some sort of correlation there. I never actually figured out the relevance of those scissors here, so if you have any ideas, let me know in the comments down below. But Yuji goes on to say how he doesn't know if humans are fundamentally good or evil. Him being a Jujutsu sorcerer is proof of that. Since becoming one, he has been constantly toeing that line of being good and evil, and at many points through the series, it's made very, very clear that Jujutsu sorcerers are not heroes. But Yuji admits how doing what he's doing now, he could very well be doing the wrong thing, so he thought he should at least let Sukuna see the humanity of someone other than himself, of someone he sees no value in. Yuji's whole conversation with Sukuna was to show Sukuna his life, to show him Yuji's life, the passage of time and how things can and will change with time, but Sukuna doesn't feel a single thing, and Sukuna sort of reflects on this during his moment with Yuji, where is it me that's changed or is the people around me changed? Now he understands everything that Yuji is saying, but it stirs nothing within him. Just as you felt when you saw how quiet your town had become, you'd expected it. He felt absolutely nothing, and it's because of this right here that Yuji has been taking pity on Sukuna. And because Yuji has been able to live a life filled with good people up until Sukuna recognizes that Yuji is taking pity on him. Now Sukuna, starting to feel rage towards Yuji, is greeted by a stare from Yuji with eyes that match his own. As Yuji's eyes go back to those normal eyes that we're familiar with now, Yuji confirms Sukuna's suspicions and tells him he's right. He tells Sukuna, I can kill you. Release Megami and return to my body and I will spare you. With Sukuna feeling the utmost of rage that I think we've ever seen him display within the series, he declares that he will kill everyone that Yuji claims holds so much value in front of him. Now, before Yuji and Sukuna start throwing hands, Yuji ends up connecting with Megami's soul. And now this is the first time that we actually see Megami speak since chapter 251. And before that, the last time we saw Megami talk was in chapter 212, which is a long time ago. But Megami tells Yuji how he's had enough and was shown a panel of Samiki. And Megami wants to create a world where Samiki wouldn't have suffered, or at the very least, could have preserved their fragile life. Eating home-cooked meals, watching the sunbeams fall onto their hanged laundry, seeing her off as she walked beside someone like Yuji. Megami was basically giving Yuji his blessing to be with Samiki, or at the very least, he wanted a man like Yuji to be happy with Samiki, which, if I'm honest with you, that's got to be the highest compliment. If your friend tells you that you're the type of person that he would let date his sister, that's got to be the highest type of compliment, I think. Mentioning how that would have been true happiness, but he's had enough. You have to remember, Megami's life for the past 17, 18 years have been nothing but suffering. He got sold by his dad to the Zenins, then he got abandoned and raised by Gojo, then Samiki falling into a coma caused by Kajaku and having his body stolen by Sukuna. After getting Samiki back, then finding out Samiki isn't actually Samiki, she's actually Yoruzu, only for Sukuna to kill her in front of his eyes and then proceed to kill Gojo in front of his eyes again. Yeah, Megami's earned the right to say enough here. And Yuji continues empathizing with Megami, sharing that after his granddad got lung cancer, he turned down the treatment that had caused some rough side effects, which again, the reincarnated twin of Sukuna being stubborn makes sense, to be honest with you. But Yuji mentions how since coming to Jujutsu High, he's had these awful thoughts being that Yuji has resigned himself to death. He's pretty much, since his grandpa passed away, resigned himself to death, and he thinks that if this situation had to last forever, he finds himself empathizing with his granddad because it's the same thing, which is why Yuji can't tell Megami to keep living. He can't do it because not too long ago Yuji was in the exact same position as Megami, and he knows how it's like. But we cut back to the real world, and this is my own personal theory, but I believe the past chapter and the conversation with Megami happened in some sort of condensed time. The past like little conversation with Sukuna and now Megami happens all just within like a little microsecond, because we both see now Yuji and Sukuna now standing in a snowy field, which is still Yuji's domain, as we see Sukuna instantly activating Hollow Wicker Basket, and Sukuna and Yuji start marching towards each other, with Sukuna thinking thinking about how he would use Gojo's method to reset his burnt out technique, but the risk is too great with the after effect of Unlimited Void persisting. Now this is where the narrator flashes us with Yuki's simple domain, Reggie's hollow wicker basket, and Yuta's domain, giving us more information about the hollow wicker basket. In contrast to domains where one actualizes a mental image, the output required for hollow wicker basket or simple domains is very little. It allows a sorcerer to buy time until a sure hit effect imbued in them eventually hits. But because Sukuna maintains the hand sign for hollow wicker basket, he's able to supplement the output and consistently defend himself against these. Now, as the ducks fly in Yuji's domain, him and Sukuna begin their final fight, their final flurry. As Sukuna throws a kick at Yuji, Yuji catches the kick and elbows Sukuna's thigh. Sukuna moves his knee back by shoulder barging Yuji and following up with a kick that Yuji guards to the face. Sukuna follows up once more with a downward punch landing directly on Yuji's face. Knocking Yuji away, the perspective shifts as if Yuji was knocked from a height as we see him falling downwards to the ground. As they land to the ground, Sukuna laughs, mentioning how he's surprised someone looking down on him would fill him with such fire. That being pitied would rouse such hate within him, and telling Yuji that his actions will cause all other humans to suffer. As we switch back to Yuji and Megumi for a split second, as Megumi is now in his kid form, in the same place that him and Gojo first met, with Yuji telling Megumi it's going to be lonely without him. This brief conversation with Megumi sparks something within him. As Sukuna walks towards Yuji, Sukuna's leg sinks into the shadows in almost the exact same way it happened to Gojo during their fight. Sukuna notes how my 10 Shadows technique stopped functioning after Maharaga was destroyed. This must be Megumi's 10 Shadows. This statement confirms each soul and body is intertwined with its curse technique. A conversation that happened between Mahito and Kenjaku that happened in Shibuya saw Kenjaku arriving at the conclusion that the body is the soul and the soul is the body. So when Sukuna took over Megumi's body, he had the body's version of the 10 Shadows, but Megumi has the soul's version essentially. At least that's my best guess given the context that happens within this chapter and the statements here. But Sukuna makes a mistake here. He mentions how Megumi's soul was submerged in the shadows, but Yuji's dismantles breathed a new life into it. It wasn't Yuji's dismantles, it was Yuji's willingness to listen and talk to Megumi. Again, Sukuna only sees this from a 2D perspective. He doesn't see the possibility that Megumi can be talked back into fighting back. He still thinks he's broken, and Sukuna being caught by Megumi like this allows for Yuji to punch Sukuna in the face, knocking him back. Yuji smiles to himself and dashes towards Sukuna, landing multiple punches on Sukuna in a fashion that was similar to Yuji's fight against the Grasshopper Curse. Kicking snow in Sukuna's face, Yuji and Sukuna grab each other by the face and begin pummeling each other. Now this panel right here feels like a direct homage to an old Pride MMA fight that saw Don Fryer vs Takayama. If you've never seen the fight, it's actually insane to see. Two dudes just stood in the corner of a ring just punching the ever-loving fuck out of each other. Yuji eventually lands a blow that stumbles Sukuna as Sukuna notes that Yuji's strikes have an effect that Sukuna cannot overcome with reverse curse technique, as we see a crack appear in hollow wicker basket above Sukuna. Remember how earlier I put a pin in the comment that Sukuna chose not to make any risks? He didn't want to make any risky moves at all, and all he needed to do was wait for his curse technique to return, and he wins. Turns out that wasn't true. Turns out, due to Yuji's strikes, crack, and hollow wicker basket, Sukuna is realizing he's going to lose to Yuji if he doesn't do something at this rate, and Sukuna now has to employ a risky tactic using the same plan Gojo did, taking the risk that Gojo did in order to reset his burnt out curse technique. Sukuna slashes Yuji's left gauntlet, and as he tries to open his own domain after he'd broken Yuji's gauntlet, he notices Yuji's not missing just one finger anymore. He's missing two. And it's at this point that it's revealed that Sukuna's final finger was left hanging in a secret place. We switch over to a flashback between Yuta and Gojo, with Gojo in Yuta's body and Yuta in Gojo's body, and Yuta asks Gojo for the final finger, wanting to feed it to Rika in order to copy Sukuna's shrine. Knowing how even during the switch training, Yuta can't read Gojo's memory, like I covered before during his Go main clash with Sukuna, Gojo mentions how this won't be enough for Yuta to properly copy the technique, and Yuta agrees. Even Inomaki had to help with the curse speech as there was tons of things that he wouldn't have known. Now Gojo suggests the idea of Rika eating a part of Yuji's body in order for this to work, which is where I explained earlier how Yuta's technique requires a body part. The bigger and stronger and more complex the technique, the more lethal the body part needed to do so. But we also get a small little flashback of Rika eating Udo's arm, and it is revealed that at this point Rika ate a piece of Charles' rib in order for her to copy the future sight ability, which is why when Yuta used it earlier, we got that little panel of Charles asking what's happening here. But Yuta goes on to talk to Meimei about the resonance between Sukuna and Yuji, and I covered this topic earlier with Todo and Meimei, anyway. But Yuta is also a big part of Todo's plan, and Yuta is pretty confident that the resonance between Sukuna and Yuji isn't at the level where Sukuna can tell what Yuji is thinking or what information he has, and that is based on the fact that Yuji also can't read Sukuna's thoughts. But anyways, after Yuta confirms Yuji has Sukuna's technique and that Gojo confirmed it with 6 eyes, we now switch back to the present time where Sukuna is stood in shock, having noticed Yuji only has 2 fingers on one hand. Knowing he himself had removed 1 finger when he moved to Megami, Sukuna finally pieces together Yuta's bluff. Off topic, but can I just say, Yuta, Yuji, and Gojo played a massive part within this fight, and Yuta's mind games with Sukuna at every point in turn, especially Todo's as well, were actually insane. To think at this point in the story, he'd only been a sorcerer for like, what, under 2 years, give or take? Anyways, we cut over to Gaku, Ganji, and Utahime, who had managed to freely get away from Shinjuku after Gojo's Hollow Purple had been fired, and we see Gaku Ganji noting how Sukuna's fingers can withstand any attack, be it with Jujutsu or Force, which is a callback to when Gojo tried to destroy the finger in the execution chamber with Yuji way back when in chapter 2. But Gaku Ganji continues and wonders if it negates Curse techniques, which is where Utahime mentions it's a binding vow. If we stop trying to destroy it and focus only on allowing the Curse technique to pass through, then maybe it'll work. However, Utahime mentions how it's only been half an hour since she woke up in reference to Nobara. Now, I've already made a video talking about the subject if you want to go check that out. I believe that this segment here is one of Gege's great fumblings within the story, if I'm honest. But Nobara has returned and is now donning an eye patch as a result of losing her eye against Mahito. Using her straw doll technique, Nobara hits Sukuna with a resonance. Sukuna notes how this technique is bad for him, and now he can't open his domain, and he's also isn't able to maintain Hollow Wikabasge. We can see multiple spikes protruding from Sukuna's chest as Nobara makes a reference to when Yuji came back from the dead earlier in the series when everyone else believed he was dead after his fight with Sukuna and Megami. We see Yuji's sure hit dismantle landing on Sukuna, and Yuji wastes 0 time in closing the distance and hitting Sukuna with a knee to the face. Taking another punch from Yuji, Sukuna ends up vomiting 5 more fingers, and we also see smoke coming from his chest as he's desperately trying to heal the damage here from resonance in Yuji's domain. Declaring that this isn't over, Sukuna punches Yuji in the stomach with both right hands, creating space between them. Sukuna notes how this isn't over, how Yuji thinks he can just flay him with some superficial domain, noting how Yuji hasn't even been using RCT and how he'd surpassed his limits long ago. The vast amount of cursed energy Yuji has expanded with this domain, he is the one that's on the ropes. Delivering yet another double overhand left. As this happened, Yuji's right hand grazes Sukuna's face, but just shortly after, Yuji's divergent fist catches Sukuna. Something that catches Sukuna completely off guard. With Yuji charging up, one final punch, Yuji unleashes the final black flash of the fight upon Sukuna. I also want to point out that this final punch here, this divergent fist into a black flash combo, is the exact same way that Yuji hit and finished off Mahito in Shibuya, which again Sukuna was present for and he should have been aware of, but because he was too overconfident in this ability and so was down looking on Yuji, he falls here. But this black flash itself absolutely ruptures through Sukuna's chest as his eyes turn white from the impact. We're given a little dream sequence here and an interesting comparison. A stark difference between Yuji and Sukuna happens in these 2 panels, as the editor comment points out even further. When Yuji spoke with Megami, he was all ears inside Megami's soul, empathizing with and trying to put him at ease, whereas Sukuna is now all mouth in Megami's soul, trying to belittle him and make him feel worthless, all in favor of Sukuna's goal. Sukuna tells Megami, just how do you think you're going to be able to go on? As I mentioned before, Megami has been through a lot, and Sukuna also emphasizes this easily here, having his body stolen, murdering his own sister, and even turning away hands from those that had reached out, and even mentions how the brat that Megami saved had ended up slaughtering thousands, which is reference to Yuji being taken over by Sukuna in Shibuya and literally just massacring the entire Shibuya. He tells Megami to just give it up, just relax, leave it to him, as we see Sukuna's true cursed form slowly being torn from Megami, this goopy black cancerous mass slowly vacating Megami's body. And Megami asks, why do you sound so desperate to Sukuna? Is it because there's only one left? Only one more of your fingers? Referring to the finger that Nobara just used resonance on. Megami hammers home the dire straits that Sukuna is in right now. Notice now there's a special way to turn him into a cursed object, but if Yuji isn't careful tearing him from Megami's body, he will die. Plus that resonance isn't good for him either, and if Sukuna's 19 fingers disappear, the last remaining one won't have enough pull to connect his soul. Megami says that he's never planned on living a normal life, and there's plenty more people in the world than just Megami. But Megami wants to try living for someone else just once more. As all of this is happening, we get the full scale on Yuji's domain, and it is massive. Again, despite not being named, Yuji's domain served its purpose, and it recreated his entire hometown, so it's got to be a big domain. Sukuna gets ripped from Megumi's body as we see Megumi's body being flung away. The remaining arms from Sukuna being disconnected, and you can see Sukuna's curse form takes on the shape of blobs and eyes with fingers also reaching out. We see the fingers reaching out, trying to get back to Megumi, but before he can, Sukuna ends up disintegrating on the floor. Now, as Yuji stands over him in a panel that feels like a direct repeat of him and Mahito again, except this time, instead of Sukuna being scared for his life, he sort of accepts what's coming, with Yuji offering the choice again, the same choice he did inside the domain, telling Sukuna, "You are me. We're born into this world unconsciously shouldering curses. What sort of monster you turn into is entirely decided by your luck. I had my gramps." And the best part about this is Yuji's kind of the person that he is because of his gramps. And Yuji's gramps is a direct reincarnation of Sukuna's twin brother. The same twin brother that Sukuna ate in the womb. If Sukuna hadn't have done that, I wonder how different do you think he would have turned out to be. But Yuji tells Sukuna, let's try once more, living not by cursing someone, but by existing alongside them. And Sukuna tells Yuji that he's impressed he would take this farce so far. Itadori Yuji, and this marks the first time and the last time in the series that Yuji is called by his name from Sukuna. As Sukuna fades away, he tells Yuji never to underestimate him because he is a curse. And that concludes every single detail that you missed in the Shinjuku Showdown. There's some stuff that I didn't include in this video, being the events at the back of the chapter and the epilogue chapters, because that sort of goes out of the Shinjuku Showdown and goes into the epilogue. And I will have a separate video for the epilogue stuff coming out if it's not already out by the time this video comes out. If it is, I'll link it. But this video took me a fucking long... This video took me a ridiculous amount of time. That dude right there isn't even the same guy that I am right now. That's how much this took. This video took me from maybe late December, early January till fucking now. It took a long time. So I would appreciate you liking and subscribing, and if you're feeling really, really generous, become a channel member, because it really helps support me. Maybe click on the Patreon, whatever. But liking and subscribing is more than enough, genuinely. And also, if you made it this far, congrats. Your cock is absolutely massive. If you've got any comments and you want to point out stuff that I missed, please. I love being corrected on stuff like this in Jujutsu Kaisen, genuinely. I love seeing the discussions, because there's always going to be stuff that I missed, even if I have titled this video everything that you missed. Maybe it's everything that I missed. Who fucking knows? Anyways, yeah. I really do appreciate you watching. So, yeah. Much fucking love. Big fucking kisses. And I'll catch you guys all in the next one. In like 3 months, probably. Probably not. Peace.